Welcome to Volume 3 of Horror Stories for Sleep. Hope you enjoy your night with these amazing stories. Before starting, please remember to subscribe and comment from where you are watching this. Let's begin. The house on Blackthorn Lane had stood empty for nearly a century, its Gothic spires cutting a silhouette against the stormy sky. Locals called it the Mourner's Keep, a name whispered with a mix of reverence and fear. They said the house wasn't abandoned. It had simply been waiting for someone to answer the knock. When Eliza Hart inherited the decrepit manor from her estranged aunt, it felt more like a punishment than a gift. She was drowning in student loans, juggling 2 jobs, and battling the relentless tide of everyday survival. The letter from the estate lawyer had been an unexpected lifeline. You are the sole beneficiary of the Blackthorn estate, provided you fulfill the terms of residency for 1 year. A year of living rent-free? It sounded almost too good to be true. When Eliza arrived, the keep looked worse than she'd imagined. Its windows were jagged with shattered glass and ivy choked the stone walls. The air was thick with the scent of mildew, but deeper than that was a faint metallic tang, like rust or blood. She brushed the thought aside. The interior was equally grim, furniture draped in sheets, cobwebs hanging like funeral veils. But it was the grand staircase that drew her attention. At its base, a massive mirror leaned against the wall, its ornate frame tarnished with age. The glass surface rippled faintly, as though it were holding its breath. The first night was uneventful. Eliza lit candles, made a bed from old quilts, and tried not to think about the strange noises, groaning wood, skittering sounds in the walls. She told herself it was an old house. Old houses made noises. But the second night was different. She awoke to the sound of knocking, 3 sharp raps echoing through the silence. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. No answer. Eliza grabbed her phone and crept downstairs. The knocking came again, louder this time, and she realized it wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from the mirror. Her reflection stared back at her, pale and wide-eyed. But then, impossibly, it moved. The mirrored version of herself raised a hand and knocked against the glass. Eliza froze, her breath caught in her throat. The reflection's lips moved silently, forming words she couldn't hear. "Who are you?" she whispered. Her reflection smiled, a cold, joyless curve of the lips. Then it stepped back, fading into the darkness of the mirror. In the following days, the mirror became an obsession. Eliza avoided it at first, covering it with a sheet, but the knocking persisted. Every night at exactly 3:13 a.m., it called to her. The house seemed to change too. Shadows stretched farther than they should, and rooms felt smaller, suffocating. The air grew heavy, and the faint metallic scent became stronger. Eliza started dreaming about the mirror. In her dreams, it wasn't a reflection. It was a doorway. She saw herself stepping through it, into a world where everything was wrong. The sky was black, the stars crimson. She wasn't alone there. Shadowy figures watched her, their eyes glowing faintly, their mouths whispering secrets she couldn't understand. When she woke, her body ached as though she'd been running. By the 3rd week, Eliza was unraveling. She avoided sleep, spending her nights pacing the halls or staring at the mirror, daring it to move. She wasn't prepared when it did. At 3:13 a.m., the sheet covering the mirror slid to the floor. Her reflection stared back at her, but it wasn't her anymore. The face was gaunt, hollow-cheeked, with eyes sunken deep into dark sockets. The reflection raised its hand, pressing its palm against the glass. Eliza felt an icy chill crawl up her spine as her own hand moved involuntarily, mirroring the gesture. The glass rippled like water. "Let me in," the reflection mouthed, its voice echoing faintly in her mind. Eliza yanked her hand away, stumbling back. No, I—" The reflection's face twisted in rage. It slammed its fists against the glass, the sound deafening. Cracks spiderwebbed across the surface, and the room filled with a low, droning hum that rattled her teeth. Eliza tried to leave the house the next morning. She packed her bags, grabbed her keys, and ran for the door. But the world outside was wrong. The sky was the same inky blackness she'd seen in her dreams. the stars blood red, the air smelled of iron, and the trees in the distance swayed unnaturally, as though something massive was moving among them. She turned back to the house, her heart pounding. The door swung open on its own, and the faint sound of knocking drifted out to her. "Let me in," the voice called again, louder this time, more insistent. Eliza stopped sleeping altogether. The mirror had taken over her life. She saw it in her dreams, heard its voice when she was awake. The reflection no longer looked like her. It was something else entirely, something ancient and malevolent. On the final night, the knocking came louder than ever before. The mirror trembled in its frame, the cracks widening until the entire surface shattered, and something stepped through. The figure that emerged from the shattered mirror was both human and not. It stood tall, draped in something dark and fluid, like a cloak of shadows that shimmered unnaturally in the dim light. Its face was a hollow void, save for two piercing points of light where eyes should have been. The air around it crackled, heavy with a presence that felt older than the house itself. Eliza froze, her breath caught in her throat. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs refused to move. The figure glided closer, its movements eerily smooth, as though it were slipping through dimensions rather than walking. What are you?" Eliza stammered, her voice barely audible. The figure tilted its head, a slow, deliberate motion that radiated menace. When it spoke, its voice was a cacophony of whispers, each word layered with echoes. "I am the Keeper." "The Keeper of what?" Eliza asked, her voice shaking. "The threshold," it replied. "The reflection, the truth beneath the surface." The Keeper raised a hand, its fingers long and gnarled, and pointed at Eliza. She felt an invisible force grip her, pulling her closer to the shattered mirror. The shards on the floor began to writhe and rearrange themselves, forming jagged, glinting patterns that seemed to hum with an otherworldly energy. "You have lingered too long," the Keeper said. "You have seen what you were not meant to see." "I didn't mean to," Eliza began, but the Keeper cut her off with a sharp gesture. "It does not matter. You must cross." "Cross where?" The Keeper didn't answer. Instead, the shadows around it began to writhe and stretch, reaching for Eliza. She screamed and stumbled backward, but the tendrils of darkness wrapped around her wrists and ankles, dragging her toward the mirror's jagged frame. As her body was pulled toward the glass, Eliza saw glimpses of the other side. A desolate wasteland bathed in crimson light, where twisted figures moved in the distance. The air was filled with a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Please," Eliza begged, "I don't belong there." The Keeper leaned closer, its void-like face inches from hers. "You have already crossed. Your reflection was the first to go. Now the balance must be restored." With a final, agonizing pull, the shadows hurled her through the broken mirror. Eliza landed hard on the other side, the air knocked from her lungs. The ground beneath her was cold and rough, like obsidian carved into jagged peaks. She looked around, her heart racing. The world was a grotesque mirror of her own, with familiar landmarks twisted into nightmarish forms. But the worst part was the figures that moved through the shadows. They looked like people, but their features were grotesquely distorted. Elongated limbs, hollow eyes, and mouths that stretched too wide. They turned toward her, their movements jerky and unnatural, and began to converge. "Eliza!" one of them rasped, its voice a chilling echo of her own. "No," she whispered, backing away. "Eliza!" it repeated, and then the others joined in, a cacophony of voices chanting her name. She turned and ran, the jagged terrain cutting into her bare feet. The figures pursued her, their voices growing louder and more insistent. Back in the real world, the mirror reassembled itself, its surface smoothing until it was whole again. In the glass, a reflection stared out, but it wasn't Eliza. The Keeper stepped back, satisfied. It turned and began to fade, its form dissolving into the shadows of the house. Eliza's voice echoed faintly from the mirror, muffled and desperate. "Help me!" she cried. "Please, someone help me!" But the house remained silent, its walls absorbing her pleas. The mirror returned to its still, unbroken state, waiting patiently for the next visitor. The house on Blackthorn Lane remained empty in the eyes of the town. Occasionally someone would mention seeing a light flickering in the windows or hearing strange noises at night. But no one dared to investigate. They knew better. The Mourner's Keep wasn't a place for the living. It was a threshold, and it always found someone willing to cross.
As one tale ends, another begins. A new shadow looms, waiting to be uncovered. This is not for the faint of heart. The crisp chill of autumn gnawed at Ian's fingertips as he stood before the decaying asylum. Its windows were shattered, jagged glass jutting out like broken teeth, and the once grand entrance now slumped under the weight of years of neglect. Moonlight cast skeletal shadows across the cracked pavement, but the inside was a void, an abyss that swallowed all light. "Come on, Ian, stop stalling." Mark jeered from the safety of the van parked down the road. Laughter erupted from the group of friends huddled there, drinks in hand. "Yeah, it's just an old building." Lisa chimed in, her voice tinged with feigned concern. "Unless you're too chicken." Ian gritted his teeth, refusing to let them see his fear. He tugged the straps of his backpack tighter and stepped forward. The warped wooden door creaked under his touch, opening with a groan that sounded almost alive. 6 hours, Ian muttered under his breath as he stepped inside. "That's all I have to last." The air changed the moment the door closed behind him. Outside, the night had been cool and brisk. Inside, it was damp and suffocating, as if the building itself exhaled decay. The faint scent of mildew mingled with something sour and metallic, a smell that Ian couldn't place but instinctively recoiled from. His flashlight flickered as he raised it, revealing long corridors lined with peeling wallpaper. The patterns, once floral and inviting, now seemed to writhe under the beam, their faded shapes morphing into grotesque faces that watched him. "Just my imagination," Ian whispered, but his voice sounded hollow, swallowed by the vast emptiness around him. He took a cautious step forward, the sound of his boots on the warped floorboards echoing unnaturally. He tried to focus on the practicalities. The group had given him a checklist of tasks to prove he'd spent the night here. Take a selfie in the main hall, find the old patient files, and, most unsettling, retrieve something from the morgue in the basement. Ian pushed deeper into the asylum, the oppressive silence pressing against his ears. Each step felt heavier, as if the air itself was trying to hold him back. He found the main hall easily enough. Its wide, vaulted ceiling loomed overhead, festooned with dangling remnants of chandeliers that once sparkled but now resembled jagged claws. "Selfie time," he muttered, forcing a nervous laugh. He pulled out his phone and switched to the front camera. His pale face appeared on the screen, distorted slightly by the dim light. As he framed the shot, something shifted in the background, a dark blur at the edge of the frame. He whipped around, heart pounding. The hall was empty, just shadows stretching endlessly into the distance. Ian let out a shaky breath. "It's nothing, just nerves." He snapped the photo quickly, not daring to check it again. The next task was to find the patient files. The flashlight flickered again as he navigated the labyrinthine corridors. Door after door hung ajar, revealing rooms filled with overturned beds, rusting equipment, and walls scrawled with incoherent symbols. At last, he reached what appeared to be an old records room. Shelves sagged under the weight of moldy folders and yellowed papers, many of them disintegrating into dust at the slightest touch. Ian sifted through the debris, careful not to disturb too much, until his hand brushed against a file thicker than the rest. It was pristine, oddly out of place amid the decay. The label read Patient 113 in bold, neat handwriting. Curiosity prickled at him. He opened the folder, revealing a series of black and white photographs. The first was of a young man, perhaps in his early 20s, with hollow eyes and a vacant expression. The second photo, taken days later according to the timestamp, showed the same man with deep gashes running down his face, his mouth twisted into a scream. The final image was a blurred mess of motion, too chaotic to decipher, yet Ian couldn't shake the feeling of movement, of something alive in the frame. A low creak echoed from somewhere deeper in the asylum. Ian froze, clutching the file tightly. Just the building settling, he whispered to himself, though his voice quivered. He stuffed the file into his backpack, not daring to linger. The last task loomed in his mind: the morgue. The stairwell leading down to the basement was narrow and claustrophobic. Each step groaned under his weight, and the air grew colder the deeper he descended. By the time he reached the bottom, his breath was visible in the flashlight's beam. The morgue was a long, sterile room, though time had stripped it of its cleanliness. Rows of metal drawers lined the walls, many of them hanging open to reveal their rusted interiors. A single steel table sat in the center, its surface marred by dark stains that Ian didn't want to think about. As he stepped inside, his flashlight flickered violently, then died. Darkness engulfed him, thick and impenetrable. Ian fumbled in his pocket for his phone, using its faint glow to navigate. He approached one of the open drawers, gagging at the sour stench wafting from within. Reaching inside blindly, his fingers brushed against something soft and cold. He yanked his hand back, but the object fell to the floor with a wet thud. Ian crouched down, holding his phone closer. It was a severed hand, grey and mottled, its fingers curled as if in agony. What the hell? Ian stumbled back, his foot catching on the table leg. A voice broke the silence. Low, guttural, and barely above a whisper. "Why did you come here?" Ian's blood ran cold. He spun around, phone shaking in his hand, but saw nothing. The voice came again, this time from behind him. "You don't belong." Ian spun wildly, the phone's dim light barely cutting through the suffocating darkness. The voice surrounded him, shifting direction with every breath. His chest tightened, heart hammering as if trying to escape. "Who's there?" he yelled, his voice cracking. The echo mocked him, bouncing down the endless corridors. "You don't belong." The words seemed to seep into his mind, more invasive with each repetition. Ian staggered backward, his foot slipping on something slick. He fell hard, the impact sending his phone skittering across the floor, its light casting erratic, spinning shadows. A shape emerged at the edge of the faint glow. At first, it was little more than a dark smear against the oppressive black, but then it shifted, a slow, deliberate motion. It was humanoid, but wrong. The limbs were elongated, unnaturally thin, and the head cocked at an angle too sharp to be possible. Ian scrambled backward on his hands and knees, his breath hitching in short, panicked gasps. The thing moved closer, the sound of its joints creaking like old wood. It stopped just before the light, its face obscured. "Leave," it hissed, the word more a guttural growl than speech. Ian's fingers found the edge of his phone. He snatched it up, shining the light directly at the figure. For a split second, he wished he hadn't. The creature's face, or what passed for it, was a featureless expanse of pale, translucent skin stretched tight over a malformed skull. Underneath, veins and muscles twitched unnaturally, as if writhing in discomfort. Ian screamed, his instincts taking over. He scrambled to his feet and bolted, not caring where he was going as long as it was away. The hallway stretched endlessly before him, the shadows deepening with every step. Behind him, the sound of pursuit grew louder. The scrape of something dragging, the snap of brittle bones moving at impossible speeds. He burst through a set of double doors into a large, circular room. The space was dominated by an enormous pit in the center, its edges lined with rusted metal railings. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the walls were covered in smeared handprints, some too large to belong to any human. Ian stopped short, his breath hitching as he realized the room wasn't empty. Figures stood along the edges, motionless and silent. Dozens of them. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes sunken and devoid of life. Each wore the tattered remains of hospital gowns, their skin marked with scars that glistened unnaturally in the faint light. One of them stepped forward, its movements jerky and puppet-like. Its lips parted, and a hollow voice echoed through the room. "You brought it here." I don't know what you mean," Ian stammered, backing away toward the door he'd come through. The figure tilted its head, its neck cracking audibly. "You woke it up." Ian's hand fumbled for the doorknob, but the metal was ice-cold, refusing to budge. He turned back, his eyes darting between the figures. They were closing in now, their movements unnervingly synchronized. From the pit came a sound, a low, resonant growl that vibrated in Ian's chest. The figures stopped, turning their attention to the darkness below. A hand, massive, gnarled, and covered in black, oozing flesh, emerged from the void, gripping the edge of the pit with enough force to bend the metal railing. Ian's mind screamed at him to move, but his legs were locked in place. All he could do was watch as the creature began to pull itself out, its form too large to comprehend, its very presence bending the light and air around it. Ian's body trembled as the creature rose higher, its hulking form emerging from the pit like a nightmare dragged into reality. The figures around the room fell to their knees, heads bowed in unison, their hands outstretched as if in worship. Ian finally found his legs. He turned and threw himself against the door, pounding on it with his fists. "Let me out," he screamed, the sound echoing uselessly in the cavernous space. Behind him, the air grew heavy, saturated with the stench of rot and a deep, guttural vibration that wasn't a sound but something he could feel, reverberating through his bones. He dared to glance over his shoulder. The creature had fully emerged now, towering over the pit. Its body was a patchwork of raw, pulsating flesh, its many limbs writhing like serpents. Its face, or what he assumed was its face, was an empty void, a hollow expanse of darkness that seemed to draw in the dim light around it. The figures began to chant, their voices low and rhythmic, speaking in a language Ian didn't recognize. The creature turned its void-like face toward them, and with an ear-splitting roar, it extended one of its grotesque limbs. The limb smashed into the kneeling figures with a wet, sickening crunch, sending bodies flying against the walls. Those who survived the first blow didn't scream. They only crawled back toward the pit, their movements desperate and reverent. Ian's survival instincts kicked in. He sprinted along the room's edge, searching for another exit, his footsteps echoing in the vast chamber. The creature's limbs slammed into the ground near him, the impact shaking the floor and throwing him off balance. He hit the ground hard, the breath knocked from his lungs. The chanting had stopped, replaced by the sound of the creature dragging its massive bulk across the floor. Ian crawled on his hands and knees, his eyes darting around for any escape. Then he saw it, a small, rusted ladder bolted to the wall, leading up to a grated platform above. He scrambled to his feet and ran for it, the creature's looming presence following close behind. As he grabbed the first rung of the ladder, he felt a searing heat on his back. He turned just in time to see the void-like face descending toward him, a maelstrom of darkness that seemed to consume everything it touched. He climbed faster than he thought possible, his hands slick with sweat and trembling with fear. The creature roared again, and Ian felt the ladder shudder as its limbs struck the wall just below him. The platform above wasn't much safer. It was narrow, the grating beneath his feet rusted and brittle. But there was another door at the far end, a heavy, industrial-looking hatch. Ian ran for it, the platform swaying precariously under his weight. Below, the creature lashed out in fury, smashing the walls and sending debris flying. The figures who hadn't been crushed were climbing toward the platform now, their movements disturbingly mechanical. He reached the hatch and yanked on the wheel to open it. It didn't budge. He threw his weight into it, desperation fueling his strength. Behind him, the figures were closing in, their hollow eyes fixed on him. With one final heave, the hatch creaked open, and Ian threw himself through it, slamming it shut just as the first figure reached the platform. He turned the wheel to lock it, the sound of metal grinding against metal echoing through the narrow space. He collapsed on the other side, gasping for air. The corridor he was in now was lit by faint, flickering lights, and the air was cooler, less oppressive. For a moment, he allowed himself to believe he was safe. But then, in the distance, he heard it, the low, resonant growl of the creature, followed by the scraping of metal. The hatch wasn't going to hold. Ian gasped for air, the pounding of his heart threatening to burst through his chest. He pressed his back against the cold metal of the hatch, eyes wide and unblinking as he listened for any sound from the other side. The darkness around him was almost as suffocating as the room he had just escaped, and his muscles ached with exhaustion. He was in a narrow corridor, dimly lit by flickering, broken light bulbs. The air felt heavy, like the silence itself was alive and waiting. His flashlight, still clutched in one trembling hand, sputtered to life just long enough to reveal the path ahead. A long, twisting tunnel leading upward. "You can't leave," a voice whispered from the shadows, so close Ian felt it brushing against his ear. His body went rigid, and he spun around, his flashlight casting a frantic beam of light across the corridor. Nothing moved, but the chill that slithered down his spine told him that he was not alone. "Leave me alone," Ian shouted, more to convince himself than anything. He stumbled forward, every step a fight against the weight of fatigue and terror pressing on him. The walls seemed to shift, closing in as he made his way through the dark, and the whispers grew louder, a chorus of mocking voices that carried the stench of decay and regret. Suddenly, he emerged into an atrium. Moonlight streamed through a cracked skylight, casting a pool of silver on the floor. In the center of the room, a single chair sat in the middle of a circle drawn in chalk. The walls surrounding it were scrawled with messages, warnings, and symbols that looked like they were smeared with blood. A figure stood in the center of the circle, facing away from him. It was the same humanoid shape from before, but now it seemed more solid, more real, as if it had been pulled from the shadows. Its limbs bent and cracked as it turned to face him, its face a twisted mockery of humanity, pale and cracked, with empty eyes that glowed with an unnatural light. "Why did you wake it?" it rasped. Its voice was layered, as if more than one being spoke through its mouth at once. Ian staggered back, his mind spinning. He reached into his backpack and pulled out the file he'd found earlier, the one with patient 113's name. I didn't know. I needed to prove I could do it, to be brave." The creature let out a sound that was almost a laugh, a dry, scraping noise that made Ian's skin crawl. "You can't prove courage when you've never faced the true darkness." The ground beneath Ian's feet trembled, and the air grew thick with the scent of rot. The shadows around him deepened, twisting into tendrils that reached for his legs, pulling him toward the center of the room. His screams echoed in the atrium as he clawed at the floor, but the whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of regret and agony that drowned out his voice. The figure in the circle reached out, its hand closing around the chair as it tilted its head, the glow of its eyes burning brighter. "Too late," it whispered, and in that moment, Ian realized the truth. There was no escape. The entity had always been here, waiting, and he had been its unwitting herald. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was the image of patient 113's face, now contorted in a silent scream, a warning he had ignored. The building fell silent, its malevolent pulse fading into a suffocating stillness. In the atrium, the circle remained, the chalk now smudged and broken, as if it had never been. And deep in the shadows, the whispers began again, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to come.
The story that follows is a record of unimaginable horror, scrawled with trembling hands and barely coherent thoughts. It is an account not of a man's descent into madness, but of his unwilling brush against the unfathomable truths that lie beneath the veil of our reality. If you find this, heed its warning. Never venture to Charnel Cove. I arrived at the secluded coastal village on a gray, oppressive morning. Charnel Cove was a forgotten relic, a smattering of weather-beaten houses clinging precariously to jagged cliffs that loomed over a restless sea. A thick mist clung to the air, muffling sounds and reducing the world to shadowy shapes. The purpose of my visit was simple: document the town's legends for an academic publication. Rumors of strange rituals and the whispers of an ancient sea-dwelling deity were the kind of folklore that my readers adored. My colleagues scoffed at such tales, dismissing them as the desperate creations of an isolated community. Yet I had always found a certain morbid fascination in the possibility that truth might lurk in the corners of such myths. Upon arriving, I was greeted with a mixture of suspicion and apathy by the villagers. They spoke little, their faces weathered and grim, their eyes always darting nervously to the sea. It was clear they resented my presence, but I persisted. There was something wrong with the place. My room at the inn overlooked the shore, where the tide dragged away with unnatural force, exposing a forest of slick, black rocks that glistened like obsidian. The village itself reeked of decay, a mix of brine and something sweeter, more pungent, something that seemed to cling to my skin and clothes. The first night brought a terrible storm. Thunder cracked like the heavens splitting open, and rain lashed against the window in a fury. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it, a low, droning chant carried on the wind. I moved to the window, peering into the rain-soaked darkness. The mist glowed faintly, illuminated by wavering lanterns carried by a procession of villagers heading toward the cliffs. Their voices blended into a guttural, rhythmic incantation that made my skin crawl. Against every ounce of reason, I followed. I kept to the shadows, my heart pounding in time with their chants. The procession led me to the edge of the cliffs, where a narrow, winding path descended to the tide pools below. The air grew colder as I followed them, my footing uncertain on the slick rocks. As I rounded a bend, I saw it. A massive stone altar, half buried in the sand, its surface carved with alien symbols that pulsed faintly in the moonlight. The villagers stood in a semicircle around the altar, their faces upturned, their chants rising to a fevered pitch. And then I saw the sea. It writhed. The water did not simply ripple, it moved with purpose, as though something immense and alive stirred beneath the surface. Shapes, impossible shapes, twisted in the depths, their outlines defying logic and perception. A figure stepped forward, an elder draped in tattered robes. In his hands, he held a small, writhing sack. He approached the altar, muttering words that made my ears ache, and upended the sack. A child spilled out, no older than 5. Before I could act, the elder raised a knife and brought it down in a single, fluid motion. The child's scream was brief, drowned out by the roar of the waves as they surged forward, engulfing the altar. The sea parted, and it rose. I cannot adequately describe what I saw, for the human mind was not meant to comprehend such things. It was vast, its form shifting and mutable, an amalgamation of eyes, tendrils, and mouths that spoke without sound. Its very existence radiated malice and hunger, and I knew in that moment that it was not of this world. I fled, my mind a storm of terror. The following days passed in a haze. The villagers avoided me, their eyes filled with knowing disdain. At night, I dreamed of the thing beneath the waves, its voice echoing in my skull. It whispered promises of power, of knowledge, if only I would return. But I could not leave. Something bound me to the village, a force as inexorable as the tides. My attempts to escape were thwarted by landslides, broken roads, and an ever-present fog that seemed alive. On the 5th night, I returned to the cliffs, drawn by a compulsion I could not resist. The altar awaited, its carvings glowing brighter than before. The villagers were absent, but I felt their presence in the shadows. The sea churned violently, and the thing rose again, its many eyes fixed upon me. "You are chosen," it spoke, its voice a thunderous vibration that rattled my very bones. I fell to my knees, weeping. My fate was sealed. I write this now, knowing that I will not survive the night. The thing demands sacrifice, and I cannot deny it. The villagers have made that clear. When the tide recedes, they will come for me. May this account serve as a warning. There are things in this world, things older and more powerful than we can imagine. To gaze upon them is to invite madness, and to trespass upon their domain is to forfeit your soul. The sea is rising. They are here.
The night shift at the county morgue was a lonely, almost mournful job. The walls, painted a sterile white, were streaked with the grime of 1,000 grim hours spent within its confines. The smell of antiseptic hung in the air, mingled with the more macabre scent of cold, unclaimed bodies. Henry Parker, the night attendant, shuffled through his duties with the practiced monotony of someone who had long since grown indifferent to the horror lurking in the shadows. The fluorescent lights above flickered now and then, casting erratic shadows that seemed to stretch and flinch as if they had a life of their own. It was almost midnight when the first movement caught his eye. Henry glanced up from the patient logbook, noting the steady, rhythmic thrum of the room's hum. In the periphery of his vision, A shudder of motion drew his attention to a nearby storage drawer. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, as though the air had shifted just enough to move the body within. He stared, willing his imagination to be quiet. "Just the draft," he muttered, reaching for the clipboard to check the list of arrivals for the evening. It was routine, at least, it should have been. But when he looked up again, the drawer was still moving, its metallic frame emitting a thin, rasping squeal as it shuddered against its lock. Henry's heart drummed a sharp, insistent beat. He took a step forward, the floor cold beneath his worn sneakers. The drawer was half open now, the body inside obscured by a veil of shadow. With a gloved hand, he tugged it open. The sight that met him stole his breath. The corpse of a young woman lay on the cold steel table, her eyes shut and her skin pale as marble. But it was her chest that made him stagger back. It moved, a rhythmic rise and fall, as if she were breathing. Henry's pulse roared in his ears. "This isn't possible," he whispered, voice cracking as his mind reeled. Corpses didn't breathe. They couldn't. But there it was, undeniable. Before he could process what he was seeing, a sharp, metallic clang echoed from the far end of the room. The double doors swung open with a force that made the walls shudder. He spun around, heart slamming against his ribs. A figure stood in the doorway. Its outline was shadowed, its limbs too long, too angular. As the figure stepped forward, the lights flickered and dimmed, bathing the morgue in a dull, sickly yellow. The room seemed to warp, the walls stretching inward as if the building itself had taken a breath. Henry's breath caught as the figure moved closer, and he realized it wasn't alone. Dozens of drawers were being pulled open, some creaking under the weight of their terrible contents. A chorus of guttural sighs and whispers filled the air, like the dead were waking all around him. He stumbled backward, but the wall behind him was no longer there. It had dissolved into an expanse of black, an endless pit that threatened to swallow him whole. Henry clawed at the wall, the cold metal biting into his skin as the figures encircled him, their grotesque faces emerging from the darkness with eyes that gleamed like polished obsidian. "Why did you wake us?" one of them hissed, its voice the creaking of dry, brittle wood. Henry couldn't answer, couldn't even scream, as his body froze under their gaze. The young woman on the table opened her eyes, and they were no longer human. They were empty, hollow, and full of unending hunger. Henry's vision blurred as panic set in. The room spun, the air turned thick with the metallic tang of blood, and the floor seemed to buckle beneath his feet. He could feel the cold fingers of death wrapping around him, a numb, suffocating chill seeping into his very bones. The figures surrounding him grew clearer with each heartbeat, their features grotesque and unnatural. Faces that seemed stitched together from the remnants of the dead, mouths open in silent, eternal screams. They leaned closer, the stench of decay rising with each breath. "Why did you wake us?" the figure at the center repeated, its voice now a chorus of whispers that filled every corner of the room. Its eyes, dark and soulless, locked onto Henry's, and he felt a sensation that he had never experienced before. His own essence being pulled, drawn into the void. A noise, deep and guttural, erupted behind him. He turned, eyes wide with terror, as another drawer slid open, and a skeletal hand emerged, followed by an arm. Then a body that seemed to disassemble and reassemble in the blink of an eye. The corpse stood upright, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its eyes not of death, but of something far worse, sentience. The whispers grew louder, a storm of voices swirling around him, speaking in tongues that made Henry's skin crawl. He could hear snippets. "It's your fault. Not just one. You awakened us all." They were accusing, resentful, and hungry. Henry stumbled backward, his pulse racing like a drumbeat in his chest. The room was shifting, the boundaries between reality and nightmare dissolving. One of the figures reached out, fingers black and twisted like roots, and its touch seared his flesh, leaving behind a trail of ice. He screamed, but it came out as a strangled whisper. The young woman on the table sat up, her movements jerky, as though she was still tethered to the afterlife by invisible strings. Her lips parted, and a voice that was not her own spoke. "Why did you bring us back, Henry?" It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. Henry's legs gave out beneath him, and he fell to his knees, unable to tear his eyes away from the horror surrounding him. I didn't, he stammered, his voice shaking. I didn't. Liar, the chorus roared, and the sound was so powerful that it knocked him over, his body sprawling across the cold, unforgiving floor. Then came silence. The figures stilled, their eyes narrowing, their jagged, stitched mouths pressing into thin, menacing lines. The air seemed to condense, heavy with something unspeakable. Henry lay there, gasping, waiting for the next move, knowing that whatever came next would seal his fate. But then, just as suddenly as it began, the room fell silent. The lights flickered once more, the fluorescent hum turning into a drone that seemed to reverberate in his very bones. The figures retreated into the shadows, the dead returning to their prisons, and the young woman on the table slumped back down, lifeless once more. Henry dared a look around. Everything appeared normal, but the suffocating silence pressed against his ears, and the sense of eyes watching him from the dark made his skin crawl. He scrambled to his feet, his limbs weak and trembling, and stumbled backward toward the door. He reached out for the handle, fingers trembling as he pulled it open. A cool breeze met him, soothing yet taunting, as if it were whispering that the nightmare had not ended, but simply paused. The corridor beyond was dark, a narrow strip of hallway lit only by the dim glow of emergency lights that flickered in rhythm with his frantic heartbeat. As he stepped out, the distant sound of drawers opening and closing echoed behind him, like the beating of a terrible, metallic heart. Henry knew then that it wasn't over. Not for him, not for anyone who had dared wake them. He stumbled out into the night, but the darkness was no longer just the absence of light. It was the presence of the dead, waiting, watching. And now, they were no longer bound by the morgue's walls. Henry didn't dare look back, but the whispers followed him, a sinister promise in every breath. They would return, and when they did, the real horror would begin. Henry's feet stumbled on the cracked pavement as he ran, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The chill of the night air clawed at him, but it was nothing compared to the icy dread that gripped his heart. He dared a glance behind him, the morbid glow of the morgue's lights still visible in the distance, a sickly beacon against the dark horizon. A low, resonant sound echoed in the distance, so deep it made his bones ache. It was followed by a whisper, as if 1,000 voices were calling out to him from the black. "Henry, come back." He shuddered and pushed himself harder, legs nearly collapsing beneath him. His mind raced as fast as his feet. What had he done? It was supposed to be a routine shift, a night spent cataloging the bodies, checking the temperature, making sure the dead remained dead. But then the power had gone out, and he'd heard that voice. A woman's voice, soft and pleading, just before the drawers had begun to move on their own. Something surged through him. Guilt, fear, the unmistakable thrill of survival. He knew he couldn't go back to the morgue. Not now. But every instinct screamed at him to flee, to get as far from that place as possible. The only problem was that the night had grown dense, as if the city itself had been swallowed by a living, breathing void. A sudden crash to his left snapped him out of his thoughts. Henry whirled around, breath catching as he caught sight of the shadow darting across the road. It was no ordinary shadow, though. It moved with a fluidity that defied the laws of nature, stretching and twisting as if the dark had come alive. He stumbled back, his heart slamming into his chest as the air around him turned cold and thick. "You can't escape," the whisper came again, this time closer. Henry's eyes met those of the shadow. They were pale, lifeless eyes, their gaze hollow yet full of a malevolent understanding. A cold shiver raced down his spine as he realized it wasn't just one of them. It was a congregation of the dead, each silhouette clawing its way from the thin veil between life and death. He turned and ran, the city now a labyrinth of dark alleys and abandoned buildings that seemed to shift and distort as he moved. The whispers grew louder, multiplying like a symphony of ghosts. He ducked into an alley, the walls pressing in on him, and tried to catch his breath. It felt as though the air was closing in, suffocating him. But it was the sudden scrape of nails against brick that made him freeze. A figure stood at the far end of the narrow passage, its head tilted unnaturally to the side, a jagged grin splitting its face from ear to ear. Henry recognized it in an instant. One of the bodies from the morgue. The eyes were hollow, but they glowed with an unearthly, simmering light. "You woke us," it rasped, its voice a garbled mess that echoed through the alley, distorting with every word. The creature stepped forward, dragging its limbs with a grotesque gait. Behind it, shadows unfurled like ink spilled across paper, slithering and shifting into forms both human and monstrous. Henry's knees went weak, and he stumbled backward. The creature's hands reached out, long fingers tipped with blackened nails that seemed to stretch and bend in impossible ways. The air crackled, a sound like dry paper burning, and the whispers sharpened into a chorus of laughter. He knew he was cornered. There was no escape. The creature stopped just in front of him, inches away, its breath cold and putrid. Henry's vision blurred as terror overwhelmed him, his mouth open in a silent scream. And then, from somewhere deep within him, he found the strength to shove it away. The creature stumbled backward, but its hollow eyes never left his, a promise seared into their depths. "Not yet," it whispered, the sound more of a threat than a statement. The shadows gathered around it, retreating into the night. Henry, now gasping and shaking, stumbled out of the alley and into the street. He dared to glance back once more, but the alley was empty. The night was still, the echoes of his heartbeat ringing louder than any sound in the city. Yet the terror remained, a phantom itch at the edge of his consciousness. The next thing he knew, a soft, familiar voice called out to him. "Henry!" He turned, eyes wide, as a figure stepped out from the darkness. It was a woman. Not just any woman, but one he knew, Sarah, the night nurse who had worked at the morgue years before she'd gone missing. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with that same unearthly glow. "You're one of us now," she said, the words twisting and overlapping like a dozen voices layered on top of each other. And as the cold hands of the dead reached out for him once more, Henry realized his fate was sealed, that the night would never end for him, nor for the city that had dared to wake them. Henry stood frozen, sweat pouring down his forehead, his skin as cold as ice. The dimness that had once been unsettling now felt like an icy hand clutching him, holding him in place. There was no sound, but he felt the weight of an overwhelming silence pressing on him, heavier than any noise he had ever heard. Shadows loomed not just in the morgue but stretched out toward the autopsy room and the changing room. Henry forced himself to move a foot, and the floor creaked beneath him, breaking the momentary spell. A soft sound, like dry leaves rustling, filled the air, and suddenly, he knew he wasn't alone. A shiver ran down his spine as he caught a glimpse at the edge of his vision. He turned quickly, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. The flickering light from the morgue's lamp briefly illuminated a figure at the end. A body, a cadaver that should have been lying cold and silent in its drawer, now sat upright, staring at him with eyes that did not exist, mouth open in a twisted grimace of horror. "It can't be," Henry whispered, his lips trembling. The figure seemed to move, not in a normal way, but as if its flesh was stretching and contracting under an unbearable tension. A bony, vein-riddled hand reached out toward him, dragging itself forward with a grotesque grace. Henry stumbled back, tripping over an autopsy table and landing with a sharp thud. The cadaver lifted its head, and a voice, part gurgle and part whisper, escaped its dry, cracked lips. "Don't leave." Time seemed to stop for a moment. Henry could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, each thump so loud he felt it might burst his head. The figure moved forward, and the air around it seemed to shrink, as if gravity itself was rebelling, pulling him back into the realm of the impossible. "Wake up!" a voice shouted from the darkness, a voice Henry didn't recognize but that called to him urgently. Without understanding how, he stood, legs trembling, and looked toward the darkest part of the hallway. There, standing in the shadows, was another morgue worker, but his skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were empty sockets. What's happening?" Henry stammered, though he didn't expect an answer. The dead man raised an arm, pointing toward the far end of the morgue. "They're coming for you. They're coming for all of us." A deep, resonant crack echoed through the room, and Henry turned to see one of the morgue drawers slowly opening, as if an invisible hand was sliding it out. From within, A figure wrapped in damp, torn cloth emerged, eyes hollow and a grin that stretched impossibly wide as if the skin could no longer contain it. Henry ran, not toward the exit, but into the hallway that led to the storage room. The flickering light went out behind him, and the sound of something dragging that should have been dead echoed throughout the space. The morgue filled with murmurs, voices that could no longer belong to the living. Henry searched desperately for a way out, but every door, every path, every corner led him back to the same place. The figure in the autopsy room, with eyes that didn't exist. Henry stumbled back, gasping for breath as his fingers scraped across the cold metal of a table. The room was alive, pulsing with a rhythm he couldn't name, each thud like the heartbeat of something ancient and furious. He glanced back, but the figure in the autopsy room had disappeared. Now, only silence filled the hallway, broken by the soft, rhythmic thumping of his own pulse. But as he turned, a familiar voice whispered his name from the direction of the storage room. It was a voice that had haunted him for weeks, a voice that belonged to Linda, his colleague who had gone missing 2 months earlier. "Henry, help me." He froze, eyes wide and locked on the shadowed entrance of the storage room. The flickering light overhead sputtered and then died completely, plunging him into complete darkness. Henry's hands balled into fists, and he took a shaky step forward, heart pounding in his chest. "Linda," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of his own breathing. Suddenly, the silence cracked like ice underfoot, and a shrill, bone-chilling laugh echoed through the morgue. It was neither human nor animal. It was something older, something that spoke of suffering and death. The last sliver of doubt fell away as Henry realized that whatever this was, it wasn't just in his mind. The figure of Linda emerged from the darkness, but it was distorted, writhing, her eyes hollow and her mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. Her skin was pallid and blistered, and when she reached out, her fingers cracked like dry twigs. "Henry, you need to run," she rasped, her voice guttural, twisted by some unseen force. "They're all coming back." Before he could scream, the walls of the morgue seemed to twist, as if reality itself were crumbling. Henry stumbled backward into the table, his body pinned as the room seemed to fold in on itself. The lights flickered once more, revealing bodies in the drawers, their eyes now open and watching him, their mouths agape, and their limbs jerking in unison like marionettes controlled by invisible strings. He screamed as the air thickened, pressing down on him with an unnatural force. The laughter returned, louder now, surrounding him, blending with a chorus of groans and whispers that spoke of a hunger that never died. "You should never have stayed," Linda's voice said from somewhere in the chaos, but now it was a chorus, dozens of voices merging into one that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Now, you're one of us." Henry's vision blurred, and he felt the chill of death creep up his spine, fingers of frost wrapping around his neck. He tried to move, to break free, but the cold was already seeping into his bones, and his limbs refused to obey. One by one, the bodies in the drawers began to rise, eyes glowing with a dull, eerie light. Henry's breath came out in short, strangled gasps as he realized there was no escape, no salvation from the dark, hollow figures closing in around him. The last thing he saw before darkness swallowed him was Linda's face, twisted into a grotesque semblance of a smile, eyes wide and reflecting an emptiness that consumed everything. And then, there was nothing but silence. The morgue, once filled with the dead, stood empty, its cold, sterile walls echoing a single, deep thud, the sound of a heartbeat that had stopped forever. Henry's consciousness flickered like a dying flame, slipping between reality and oblivion. His mind, tangled in the dark shrouds of panic and despair, found no respite as the silence pressed against him, suffocating and complete. But then, the quiet was broken by a single, hollow breath. It was as though the room itself inhaled, a deep, resonant gasp that seemed to reach deep into Henry's chest, drawing him back from the abyss. He stirred, eyes fluttering open to the same oppressive darkness, but it was different now. The room was no longer silent. The soft, slow scrape of movement surrounded him, rhythmic and alien. A voice, small and weak, whispered through the air, carrying with it the weight of 1,000 lifeless souls. "Henry, you're still here." His breath caught in his throat, the familiarity of the voice piercing through his fear. It was Linda's. The once dead and decayed woman was now standing before him, but not as she was before. Her form was shifting, warping as if a film reel was running too fast. Her eyes were black, deep wells that swallowed all light, and her mouth moved with the slow, pulsing agony of a being caught between life and death. What do you want?" Henry rasped, his voice barely a whisper. His heart drummed a staccato beat against his ribs, loud enough to drown out all else. Linda tilted her head, a broken smile spreading across her face. It was not a smile of reassurance. It was a grin that spoke of doom, of promises made and broken in the depths of the forgotten. The air around him began to crackle, the temperature plummeting as if the room had become an extension of the grave itself. "You," Linda whispered. The words stretched out like a noose. "You are the key." Henry's eyes widened as the realization hit him. This place was never just a morgue. It was a gateway. He was never meant to be here. No one was. But he had walked in, driven by curiosity, by the unquenchable need to understand. And now, it was too late. The bodies that had stirred, the shadows that moved, they were not simply ghosts of the past. They were the heralds of something ancient, something that had waited for this moment, for him. The figures that had once been dead now stood, their limbs contorted in unnatural postures. Their eyes, black and empty, fixed on him with a hunger that transcended human comprehension. They closed in, bodies shifting in erratic, jerking movements, their mouths opening to reveal gaping, abyssal throats. Henry pushed himself to his feet, legs trembling as he stumbled backward. The floor beneath him seemed to melt, a deep, pitch-black void that yawned wide, ready to pull him into its depths. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of desperate, pleading voices that made his blood run cold. "Please, help us. Set us free." He knew now that Linda was no longer Linda. She was a conduit, an unwilling harbinger of the dead. The power in her eyes flared, a sickly green light that spread across the room like a spreading disease. The walls wept with condensation, forming grotesque images of the dead that seemed to move and shift, staring at him with hollow eyes. "I won't let you take me," Henry shouted, more to himself than to the figures closing in around him. His voice broke, but the fear that surged through his veins ignited a last spark of defiance. Linda took a step forward, her face no longer resembling a woman but a mask, with cracks splitting her features to reveal the nothingness beneath. "It's too late, Henry. They're already inside you." And with that, the room exploded in an incandescent burst of light, the walls splintering and shuddering as if caught in the throes of a violent seizure. Henry felt himself being pulled, sucked into the blinding nothingness, his screams torn from his lips and lost to the roar of an eternal wind. The morgue went quiet once more, empty and still. The lights flickered back on, bathing the room in a sterile glow that made the horror of moments before seem like a dream. But in one of the drawers, a soft, rhythmic thud echoed, as if something within were awakening. And then there was silence. Henry's face, pale and frozen in an expression of terror, remained the last trace of his existence as the shadows in the room seemed to stir, waiting for the next soul to wander into their grasp.
Once again, dear listener, I beckon you into the darkness, where shadows stretch long and reason falters. What follows is a tale drawn from the recesses of a tortured mind, its every word laden with the weight of guilt and the whisper of death. Venture onward if you dare, but know that some doors, once opened, can never be closed. The hour was late, and the wind howled with a voice that seemed to echo from the depths of despair itself. My home, an estate long neglected, groaned under the weight of the storm. It was here, amid the crumbling walls and flickering candlelight, that I awaited him. Anton Farrow, the man who had wronged me beyond forgiveness. The memory of his betrayal burned vivid in my mind. A trusted confidant, he had seduced my beloved Lenore, stolen her affections, and left me to wallow in the ruins of a love I had thought eternal. I resolved to confront him, to extract a confession and mete out justice in the manner of the ancients, cold, unrelenting, and absolute. He arrived, unknowing of my intent, his visage as smug as ever. I bade him enter, feigning camaraderie, and led him to the heart of my estate. A corridor, narrow and endless, its walls painted crimson by time and the damp breath of decay. "Anton," I said, my voice steady despite the tumult within. "Do you not hear it?" He paused, his brow furrowing. "Hear what, my friend?" "The voices," I whispered. "The voices of the forgotten." The corridor swallowed us as we walked, the faint glow of my lantern casting grotesque shadows upon the walls. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of mildew and something fouler, a stench that gnawed at the edges of sanity. "You're unwell," Anton remarked, his tone laced with condescension. "Unwell?" I echoed, my laughter a brittle thing. "No, dear Anton. I see with a clarity you could never comprehend." The walls seemed to close in, the crimson hue deepening with every step. I spoke of Lenore then, of her beauty, her grace, and the agony of her absence. Anton's feigned ignorance enraged me, his lies fueling the inferno of my wrath. "Do you think me blind?" I spat, turning to face him. "Do you believe your treachery could remain hidden?" His denial was swift, his protestations hollow, but I would not be swayed. "Come," I commanded, seizing his arm and dragging him forward. "The truth lies ahead." The corridor opened into a chamber, its walls adorned with mirrors tarnished by age. In the center stood a single chair, its leather seat cracked and stained. I gestured for him to sit. "Do you remember this place?" I asked, my voice a serpent's hiss. He shook his head, his confidence faltering. "Liar!" I roared, my fists clenched. "It was here that you sealed my doom. It was here that you whispered false promises into her ear and turned her against me." He stood, his face pale. "You're mad." "Madness?" I stepped closer, my reflection warping in the mirrors. "If this is madness, it is of your making." The lantern's flame danced wildly as I circled him, its light revealing shapes within the mirrors, figures distorted and grotesque, their hollow eyes fixed upon us. "Confess," I demanded, the word a growl. He refused, his pride unbroken. In my rage I struck him, the blow echoing like a gunshot. He fell to the ground, and for a moment all was still. Then the voices began, low at first, a murmur that rose to a cacophony. The mirrors trembled, the figures pressing against their glass prisons, their mouths opening in silent screams. Anton scrambled to his feet, his bravado replaced by terror. "What is this?" he cried. "This," I said, "is retribution." The figures emerged, their forms liquid in shadow, their hands cold as the grave. They surrounded Anton, their touch drawing forth his sins, their whispers condemning him to the abyss. He screamed, a sound that pierced my very soul, but I did not intervene. This was justice, pure and unyielding. When it was over, the figures retreated, their hunger sated. Anton's lifeless body lay crumpled on the floor, his face twisted in eternal agony. I stood in silence, the weight of my actions settling upon me. The corridor seemed to breathe, its crimson walls pulsating with a life of their own. As I turned to leave, I caught my reflection in the mirrors. The figures stared back, their hollow eyes now my own. I am still here, trapped within the corridor, a prisoner of my own vengeance. The walls bleed, the voices scream, and the mirrors show only my sins. To those who find this, heed my warning. Justice, when twisted by rage, becomes a curse. Do not seek this place. Do not awaken the crimson corridor.
The end of one tale often heralds the beginning of another. Within the quiet corners of the mundane, darkness waits patiently, unseen yet omnipresent, like a shadow at the edge of your vision. This is where our story begins, where the familiar twists into the grotesque, and the ordinary hides a malevolent secret. The house on Winter's Hill was more of an eyesore than a landmark. Its tilted roof sagged like a weary sigh, and its peeling grey paint revealed the raw, weathered boards beneath. For years, it had been a topic of fascination among the townsfolk, who shared whispered rumors about its strange past over coffee at the diner. A murder-suicide, some claimed. Others swore it had been the site of a cult ritual gone wrong. And then there were the few, always speaking in hushed tones, who said the house was simply wrong. Not cursed, not haunted, but a living, breathing entity that devoured those foolish enough to step inside. Elliot Fairweather had heard all the stories, but as he stood before the house now, with its gaping front door hanging ajar like a toothless mouth, none of them seemed particularly important. What mattered was that the house was his ticket out of poverty. At 33, Elliot's life was a string of near misses and bad luck. An aspiring writer, he'd never managed to get anything published beyond the occasional short story in obscure online magazines. His bank account was a joke, his apartment barely livable, and his landlord had recently started leaving eviction notices taped to his door. So when the letter came, a formal invitation to spend a month in the house on Winters Hill, with a $50,000 payout for documenting his experience, he didn't hesitate. Sure, it reeked of desperation, but he wasn't in a position to care. 50 grand was a fortune, and all he had to do was write about some creepy old house. Elliot arrived just before dusk, the dying sunlight casting long shadows across the overgrown lawn. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. He parked his rusted sedan at the edge of the driveway and pulled his suitcase from the trunk. The letter had been clear: bring enough supplies for a month and come alone. The inside of the house was as dismal as its exterior. The floorboards creaked with every step, and the wallpaper was yellowed and peeling. Dust hung in the air, visible in the weak light streaming through the cracked windows. Elliot set his suitcase down in what appeared to be the living room. A single armchair sat in the corner, its fabric moth-eaten and stained. Beside it, a small table held an antique lamp, its bulb flickering weakly when he turned it on. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of birds outside. Elliot unpacked quickly, trying to shake the feeling that he was being watched. By the time night fell, he had settled into one of the upstairs bedrooms. It was the least disgusting room he could find, with a relatively clean mattress and an actual lock on the door. He sat at the small desk by the window, his laptop open and ready. His first entry was straightforward. Day 1. The house is every bit as creepy as I expected. It smells like mold, and the floor feels like it might cave in under my weight. But it's quiet, too quiet. No footsteps, no whispers, just silence. Maybe this will be easier than I thought. As he typed, a faint sound caught his attention, a soft, rhythmic tapping. He paused, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. The sound stopped. He turned his head, scanning the room. Nothing. With a shrug, he continued typing. The stories about this place are ridiculous. I don't feel anything here except boredom. Maybe this will make for a dull story after all. The tapping resumed, louder this time. It was coming from the wall behind him. Elliot stood slowly, his heart pounding. He approached the wall and pressed his ear against it. For a moment, there was only silence. And then, a whisper, so faint he almost missed it. Get out. Elliot staggered back from the wall, his breath caught in his throat. He told himself it must have been the wind, a draft through the old house creating some kind of auditory illusion. But the weight of the words, faint though they were, lingered like a shiver down his spine. Get it together, he muttered to himself, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow in the empty room. He returned to his desk and tried to focus on his writing, but the whispers had unsettled him. The night dragged on. Every creak of the floorboards and sigh of the wind outside made his nerves jump. By the time midnight rolled around, Elliot had given up on working and decided to sleep. The bed was lumpy, the springs digging into his back, and the blankets smelled faintly of mildew. He lay awake for what felt like hours, staring at the cracked ceiling. And then he heard it again. The tapping. This time, it wasn't coming from the wall. It was at the door. Elliot sat up, his chest tight with fear. The sound was soft but deliberate, a slow, steady knock. "Hello?" he called out, his voice trembling. The tapping stopped. He grabbed his phone from the nightstand and turned on the flashlight, aiming it at the door. The beam of light revealed nothing out of the ordinary, just the peeling paint and tarnished brass handle. With a deep breath, he swung his legs out of bed and stood. The wooden floor was icy beneath his feet as he approached the door. His hand hesitated on the knob before he twisted it open. The hallway was empty. He stepped out, shining his flashlight around. The air felt colder here, heavy with an unplaceable smell, something metallic and sour. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist as he moved, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. "Hello?" he called again, louder this time. No answer. He was about to retreat to his room when he noticed something strange. At the far end of the hallway, where the dim light didn't quite reach, there was a faint shape on the floor. He approached cautiously, his heart pounding in his ears. The shape resolved into a single, muddy footprint. It was too large to be his own. Elliot backed away, his flashlight flickering as if on cue. His breathing quickened as he turned and stumbled back to his room, slamming the door shut behind him. He locked it and leaned against the door, clutching the phone to his chest. This wasn't just his imagination. Someone else was in the house. He called the number on the letter, the one that had invited him here. It rang twice before a smooth, almost mechanical voice answered. "This is the Winters Hill Project. How can we assist you, Mr. Fairweather?" "There's someone in the house," Elliot said, his words tumbling over each other. "I heard tapping, and there's a footprint in the hallway. I think—" "Remain calm," the voice interrupted. "The house is old. Strange noises are to be expected. As for the footprint, it's likely yours. The mind can play tricks in stressful environments. It's not mine," he snapped. "It's bigger than my foot, and it's fresh." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a faint clicking sound. "Noted. We'll send someone to investigate in the morning. In the meantime, we recommend staying in your room. Lock the door and try to get some sleep." The line went dead. Elliot stared at his phone in disbelief. He wanted to leave, wanted to grab his things and run out of this nightmare of a house. But the money. He needed the money. Resigning himself to the situation, he crawled back into bed, his flashlight clutched tightly in one hand. Sleep came in fits and starts, interrupted by the sound of creaking floorboards and distant whispers. By the time the pale light of dawn filtered through the window, he was more exhausted than rested. Downstairs, he found no sign of anyone, no fresh footprints, no muddy trail. It was as if the night before had been a hallucination. Determined to prove he wasn't losing his mind, Elliot decided to explore the house in daylight. Armed with his phone and a makeshift weapon, a rusty fire poker he found in the living room, he began his search. The first floor was as decrepit as he remembered. The kitchen was a graveyard of outdated appliances, the dining room covered in a fine layer of dust. But when he opened the door to the basement, he hesitated. The stairs descended into darkness, the smell of damp and rot wafting up to greet him. He almost turned back, but a flicker of movement at the bottom caught his eye. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing down the staircase. There was no response, but the faint sound of breathing reached his ears. Elliot gripped the fire poker tighter, his knuckles white. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to bolt out of the house and never return. But his pride and curiosity held him rooted to the spot. With each creaking step downward, the air grew colder and heavier, the dampness clinging to his skin. The flashlight from his phone illuminated the narrow staircase, revealing crumbling brick walls streaked with something dark and wet. The breathing grew louder, echoing off the walls. It was shallow and ragged, almost human. At the bottom of the stairs, the beam of his flashlight caught a figure crouched in the corner, its back turned to him. "Hey!" he called, his voice cracking. "Who's they?" The figure didn't move. Summoning his courage, Elliot stepped closer. His flashlight revealed a man in tattered clothing, his body hunched unnaturally, like a broken marionette. "Are you okay?" Elliot asked, his voice trembling. The man turned slowly, his movements jerky and unnatural. His face, what remained of it, was a grotesque mask of decay, the skin sloughing off in patches to reveal sinew and bone. Clouded eyes locked onto Elliot, and the creature let out a guttural growl. Elliot stumbled back, his flashlight shaking wildly. The man, or whatever it was, lunged at him with inhuman speed. He swung the fire poker blindly, the metal colliding with a sickening crunch. The creature fell back, but only for a moment. It rose again, its broken limbs twisting unnaturally as it advanced. Panic surged through Elliot as he scrambled back up the stairs, the creature's growls and the sound of its claws scraping against the walls echoing behind him. He burst into the daylight of the living room, slamming the basement door shut and shoving a chair under the handle. His chest heaved as he tried to catch his breath. The house was supposed to be empty. No one had lived here for decades. So what was that thing? His thoughts were interrupted by a faint tapping sound. Not from the basement this time, but from the front door. Elliot froze. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. "Who is it?" he shouted, his voice shaking. The tapping stopped. Slowly, he approached the door, gripping the fire poker tightly. He peeked through the peephole but saw nothing. Then the tapping began again, this time from the windows. Elliot's heart pounded as he turned to face the living room. Shadows flitted across the curtains, moving too quickly to be human. The whispers returned, surrounding him, growing louder until they were a deafening cacophony. "Get out!" they screamed in unison. Elliot didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed his bag and bolted for the front door, yanking it open. The sunlight blinded him as he stumbled onto the overgrown lawn. The whispers faded, and the tapping ceased. For a brief moment, he felt relief. Then he turned back toward the house and froze. In every window, faces stared out at him, pale, hollow-eyed, and grinning. Elliot staggered back, his breath caught in his throat. The faces pressed against the windows of the decrepit house were impossibly still, yet their grins widened as if mocking his terror. His trembling hands dropped the fire poker, the clatter lost in the pounding of his heart. He forced his feet to move, stumbling down the gravel path toward his car. The keys felt like lead in his pocket as he fumbled them out, his fingers refusing to cooperate. The faces remained, unblinking, watching his every move. When he finally managed to unlock the car and slide inside, the oppressive silence was shattered by a deafening roar. The engine refused to turn over, sputtering violently before dying completely. Elliot pounded the steering wheel. "Come on. Damn it." A sharp knock on the driver's side window made him jump. His head whipped around, expecting one of those grinning faces. Instead, he saw darkness, pure and impenetrable. The knocking came again, rhythmic and deliberate. But there was no one there. Something was wrong with the light. The sun had been shining only moments ago, but now an unnatural dusk cloaked the area. Shadows stretched long and thin, as if they were alive, creeping toward the car. Elliot locked the doors, though a part of him knew it wouldn't matter. The shadows reached the vehicle, their movement slow but deliberate. They slithered up the tires, wrapping around the frame like grasping fingers. As the darkness consumed the car, Elliot's breath came in shallow gasps. Then, silence. The world outside was gone. No trees, no house, no sky. Just endless blackness. He heard it then. A soft, rasping voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You were warned." Elliot's scream was cut short as the driver's side door wrenched open. A hand, skeletal and impossibly strong, yanked him out. He hit the ground hard, his head swimming from the impact. As he struggled to his feet, he realized he was no longer near the house. The overgrown lawn and gravel path were gone, replaced by a barren landscape shrouded in mist. Figures emerged from the fog, their forms indistinct at first but growing clearer as they approached. They were the faces from the windows, now fully corporeal and even more grotesque. Their grins were too wide, splitting their faces unnaturally. Their hollow eyes seemed to burn with an inner light, and their hands twitched eagerly, as if anticipating something. "You came to the wrong place," one of them said, its voice a wet gurgle. Elliot backed away, but the figures closed in, their movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring his fear. "I didn't mean to," he stammered. "Meaning doesn't matter," another interrupted, its grin widening impossibly. "You stepped into what you didn't understand." The air grew colder, each breath burning his lungs. Elliot's mind raced, searching for a way out. The shadows danced around him, teasing him with glimpses of safety before vanishing. "You can't escape," The voices whispered in unison, growing louder, more insistent. And then, as if summoned by his terror, a larger figure emerged from the fog. It towered over the others, its form cloaked in tattered black robes that seemed to bleed into the ground. Its face was obscured, but the overwhelming sense of malice emanating from it was suffocating. Elliot's knees buckled. He wanted to run, to fight, to do anything, but his body betrayed him, paralyzed by fear. The figure raised a hand, long and bony, pointing directly at him. "You," it said, its voice a deep, resonant echo that shook the ground. "You will feed the darkness." The towering figure loomed closer, its presence an oppressive weight that seemed to crush the very air around Elliot. His chest tightened, and every instinct screamed at him to flee, but his legs remained frozen as if bound by invisible chains. The grotesque figures circling him began to chant, their voices a chilling symphony of malice. The words were incomprehensible, yet they clawed at his mind, filling him with an overwhelming sense of dread. Elliot's eyes darted around, searching for any escape, but the barren landscape stretched endlessly, the fog swallowing everything. Desperation clawed at him, and with a sudden surge of adrenaline, he forced himself to move. He ran. The ground beneath his feet felt wrong, soft and yielding, like flesh. Every step was a struggle, as if the earth itself resisted his escape. The chanting grew louder, the voices following him no matter how far he went. Ahead, a faint light pierced the fog, its warm glow a beacon of hope. Elliot sprinted toward it, his lungs burning and legs aching. The light grew brighter, illuminating a doorway standing impossibly in the middle of the void. He reached it and didn't hesitate, throwing himself through the threshold. The chanting ceased abruptly as the door slammed shut behind him. Elliot found himself in a room that was impossibly familiar, a perfect replica of his childhood home. The warm glow of a fireplace bathed the space in a comforting light, and the scent of pine and cinnamon filled the air. For a moment, he felt safe. "Elliot," a voice called, soft and melodic. He turned to see a woman sitting by the fire, her back to him. Her presence was soothing, her voice tugging at something deep within him. Who are you?" he stammered. The woman stood and turned slowly. Her face was beautiful, radiant even, but her eyes were hollow voids, endless pits of darkness. "I am what you sought," she said, her voice layered with 1,000 others. "I am what you've always feared." Elliot backed away, his heart racing. "This isn't real. None of this is real." "Oh, but it is," she replied, stepping closer. Her form began to shift, her beauty dissolving into something grotesque. Her skin sagged and twisted, her limbs elongating unnaturally. The room around them darkened, the warmth replaced by an icy chill. The walls began to bleed shadows, tendrils snaking toward him. "You came to us," the creature said, her voice now a guttural snarl. "You invited us in." The tendrils lashed out, wrapping around Elliot's arms and legs, pulling him to the ground. He struggled, screaming, but they held firm, dragging him toward the fireplace. The flames turned black, emitting no heat but an overwhelming sense of despair. "No, please," he begged, tears streaming down his face. The creature loomed over him, her hollow eyes boring into his soul. "You will feed the darkness, as all who wander here do." The tendrils pulled him into the black flames, his screams swallowed by the void. The fog lifted, and the decrepit house stood silent once more. The door creaked open, revealing a warm, inviting glow from within. A faint melody played, soft and enticing. In the distance, a figure approached, drawn by the light and the promise of safety. The house waited, patient and eternal.
Once more, I invite you to traverse the dim corridors of despair, where melancholy and terror dance hand in hand. The tale you are about to read is a dirge for the lost and the damned, its every word a lamentation steeped in grief. Beware, for the echoes of the bells may yet reach you, calling you into the abyss. It was in the waning of the year that I found myself summoned to the estate of my late uncle, a man whose eccentricities had long estranged him from the world. The call came by way of a letter, penned in a trembling hand and bearing only these words: The bells toll only for me now. Come, if you would hear them too. Though the message bore neither salutation nor signature, I knew its author at once. My uncle, Elias Vale, had always spoken in riddles, his words as enigmatic as the man himself. But he was long dead, claimed by a wasting illness that had left his estate to me in ruin and disrepair. Yet the handwriting was unmistakably his. I arrived at Vale Manor beneath a sky darkened by storm clouds. The house loomed before me, its silhouette jagged against the horizon, its windows like empty eyes staring into the void. The air was heavy with the promise of rain, and the scent of decay clung to the grounds. Crossing the threshold, I found the interior as desolate as I had imagined. The walls were draped in cobwebs, the furniture swathed in dust, and the air thick with a silence so profound it seemed to hum. But then I heard it, the faint ghostly chime of bells, distant yet distinct, their sound mournful and unrelenting. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The bells were not of this world. Of that I was certain. They seemed to emanate from the very walls, their resonance weaving through the fabric of the house. I followed the sound, my footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. It led me to the parlor, where a single object lay uncovered, a grand clock, its face cracked and its hands frozen. Above it hung a portrait of my uncle, his eyes painted with a fervor that made them seem alive. "The bells," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Are they yours, Elias?" The reply came not in words, but in a sudden gust of wind that extinguished the candles. In the darkness the chime grew louder, more insistent, and with it came a sensation of being watched. I lit the candles anew and found the portrait changed. My uncle's mouth, once a stoic line, now curled into a grim smile. The bells grew more persistent with each passing night. They called to me in my dreams, their tolling a requiem for my sanity. I began to see figures in the shadows, their forms indistinct but their intent unmistakable. They lingered at the edges of my vision, their hollow eyes fixed upon me. In desperation, I scoured the manor for answers. I searched the libraries, the cellars, even the attic, where dust lay thick as snow. But it was in the chapel, long abandoned, that I found the truth. The altar was bare, save for a journal bound in cracked leather. The pages were filled with my uncle's writing, his words descending into madness as they recounted his obsession with the bells. "They toll for the damned," he had written. "Their sound is a summons, a herald of judgment. I have heard them all my life, and now they call for me." The final entry was a scrawl, barely legible. "To escape their call, I have bound myself to this house, but the bells are relentless. They will claim another." I closed the journal, my hands trembling. The meaning was clear. The bells were a curse, their tolling a harbinger of doom for all who heard them. And now they had chosen me. The days that followed were a blur of terror. The bells grew deafening, their sound driving me to the brink of madness. The figures in the shadows came closer, their forms now distinct, emaciated, skeletal, their faces hollow and their mouths agape in silent screams. I tried to flee, but the house would not allow it. The doors locked of their own accord, the windows unyielding as iron. I was a prisoner, ensnared by the curse that had claimed my uncle. On the final night, the bells reached a crescendo, their sound reverberating through my very soul. The figures surrounded me, their hollow eyes alight with malice, and then the clock in the parlor began to chime. Its hands, frozen for so long, now moved with unnatural speed. Each toll of the clock was echoed by the bells, their combined sound a cacophony that shattered the silence of the manor. As the final chime rang out, the figures descended upon me, their skeletal hands cold and unyielding. I screamed, but no sound escaped my lips. I awoke to silence. The bells were gone, their tolling replaced by an oppressive stillness. But I was no longer myself. My reflection in the cracked mirror showed a face hollow and lifeless, my eyes now as empty as those of the figures. The house, too, had changed. The dust and decay were gone, replaced by an air of sterile order, and in the parlor the portrait of my uncle had vanished, replaced by one of me. Now I am bound to this house, its new keeper, its latest victim. The bells have claimed me, as they will claim another. Beware their toll, dear reader, for when they call, there is no escape.
Let me preface this account with an earnest plea. Do not seek what lies beneath the veil of the mundane. There is a sanctuary in ignorance, a fragile balm to the human soul that keeps us from succumbing to the vastness of what we dare not comprehend. I write this not as a warning, for I fear it is too late for that, but as a record for the unfortunate who might find themselves drawn, as I was, into the embrace of the abyss. My name, though it hardly matters now, is Elias Carnsworth. Before the events that unraveled my sanity, I was a lecturer of marine archaeology at Miskatonic University, a position I held with pride and reverence. My pursuits were not uncommon for someone in my field, mapping ancient shipwrecks, cataloging relics of a bygone age, and indulging in the occasional expedition funded by the university. It was during one such endeavor that I first heard whispers of the abyssal call. The name came to me from a fragmentary journal I uncovered amidst the wreck of the Enduring Providence, a whaling ship that had disappeared in 1876, taking with it all hands and leaving behind only wild tales of storms and sea monsters. The journal belonged to its captain, Alden Greaves, whose last entry was chilling in its brevity. They sing to me from the black. Their voices are the death knell of reason. We are undone. These words should have dissuaded me. They should have ended my fascination with the Providence and her ill-fated crew. Instead, they consumed me. The subsequent weeks were a haze of research and obsession. I combed through maritime records, folklore, and half-remembered tales from seafarers too old to care about the ridicule of their peers. A pattern began to emerge, one I could scarcely believe but could not ignore. Across centuries and continents, there were stories of sailors hearing a song, not the keening wail of wind through sails nor the haunting cry of seabirds, but a melody impossibly deep, resonant, and otherworldly. It was described as both a siren's lure and a dirge for the soul, a sound that beckoned men to their doom beneath the waves. Some accounts spoke of entire ships vanishing without a trace, their crews leaving behind only fragmented records of madness and despair. What troubled me most was the recurrence of a single location. The coordinates 47 degrees 9 minutes south, 126 degrees 43 minutes west. A barren stretch of ocean, far from any trade route or known landmass. It seemed to be the epicenter of these tales. The location came to be known among sailors as the Silent Meridian. I resolved to go there, driven not by courage but by a fatal curiosity I could neither suppress nor explain. Our vessel, the Ardent Explorer, was modest but capable, her crew an assortment of seasoned mariners and eager scholars. I chose my team with care, selecting those who possessed a balance of expertise and skepticism. Yet, as we neared the meridian, a palpable unease settled over us. The sea grew unnaturally still, its surface an unbroken mirror that reflected the sullen gray of the sky. It was on the 7th day that we first heard it, the song. At first, it was faint, barely distinguishable from the creak of the ship's timbers or the murmur of the ocean. But as the hours passed, it grew louder, more insistent, a low thrumming that resonated in our bones. It defied language, a sound both musical and alien, invoking a primal fear that defied logic. My crewmates reacted as if a switch had been flipped within them. Some grew silent and withdrawn, their eyes glassy and unfocused. Others became agitated, muttering half-formed words in languages I did not recognize. I, too, felt the song's pull, a seductive promise of knowledge and revelation, of truths buried in the depths where no light had ever reached. It was on the 9th day that we saw the first sign of the abyssal entity. The sonar detected an anomaly, an impossibly vast structure beneath us, its contours defying natural geometry. It was not a shipwreck nor a natural formation, but something else entirely, something alive with an ancient malevolence that could not be comprehended by mortal minds. The descent into the depths was fraught with terror. As our submersible plunged into the ink-black sea, the song grew deafening, and with it came visions, shadows of creatures too immense and grotesque to be real, their forms writhing in defiance of physics and reason. When we reached the structure, we found it was no ruin but a temple, its spires and arches etched with symbols that seemed to writhe and shimmer as if alive. The temple seemed to pulsate with an unholy rhythm, matching the cadence of the song. It was as though the structure itself was alive, breathing, its alien geometry defying all comprehension. The carvings on its surface were not merely ornamental. They conveyed something, stories, warnings, or perhaps commands. But their meaning eluded us, leaving only a profound sense of unease. As we approached the edifice, the light from our submersible's beams seemed to falter, swallowed by the oppressive blackness that emanated from the temple. The closer we came, the more the crew succumbed to madness. Dr. Ellison, our linguist, began to speak in tongues, his voice guttural and unnatural, as though some other being was speaking through him. Harding, our engineer, clawed at his own skin, screaming that something was inside him, crawling, watching. I should have ordered us to surface then, to abandon this cursed place. But the song, oh, that accursed melody, had sunk its hooks into my soul. It promised answers, enlightenment, an escape from the fragility of human existence. And so, we pressed on. The submersible docked at what appeared to be an entrance, an archway so massive it dwarfed our vessel. The opening emitted a faint bioluminescent glow, its hue a sickly green that seemed to seep into the edges of my vision. We disembarked, stepping onto a surface that felt unnervingly organic, like flesh stretched taut over bone. Inside, the air, or whatever passed for it, was thick and oppressive, carrying with it a stench of decay and brine. The walls were alive with movement, tendrils of some unnameable substance writhing in and out of the carvings. Dr. Ellison collapsed to his knees, convulsing, his eyes rolling back as he began to chant. The words were not his own, but those of something older, something watching. What followed was chaos. Harding, in his madness, struck one of the bioluminescent walls with a wrench, and the structure responded as though wounded, emitting a low, resonant groan that reverberated through the temple. The floor beneath us shifted, and the song intensified, no longer a seductive melody but a cacophony of anguish and rage. It was then that we saw it. The entity defied form, an amalgamation of shadows and shapes that seemed to flicker between dimensions. Its eyes, or what I perceived as eyes, bored into my soul, filling my mind with visions of a universe far older and more hostile than I had ever imagined. It was not merely a creature but an idea, a concept of such vastness that to comprehend it would shatter the mind. The crew fell apart. Harding was the first to succumb, throwing himself into one of the writhing walls, which absorbed him like quicksand. Dr. Ellison's chanting reached a fever pitch before he too collapsed, his body crumbling into dust as though he had aged centuries in mere seconds. And yet, I remained. Perhaps it was the song, now intertwined with my very being, that shielded me. Or perhaps the entity had a purpose for me, a cruel amusement in sparing my life as it claimed the others. The temple began to collapse as the entity receded into the shadows, its wrath momentarily sated. I stumbled back to the submersible, alone and half-mad, and initiated the ascent. The journey to the surface was agonizing, the song fading but never fully leaving me. Its echoes lingered in my mind, a constant reminder of what I had seen. When I finally emerged into the daylight, I was greeted not by salvation but by desolation. The ardent explorer was gone, vanished without a trace, leaving me adrift in the open ocean. The horizon was empty, save for the encroaching storm clouds that seemed unnaturally dark, as though the entity's presence had followed me to the surface. I write this account from the solitude of a hospital room, where I am kept under constant observation. The doctors believe me to be delusional, a victim of deep-sea psychosis. They do not hear the song that still plays in the back of my mind, growing louder with each passing day. I know it is only a matter of time before it calls me back to the depths. For the entity does not forget, nor does it forgive. It waits in the silent places of the world, biding its time until we are foolish enough to seek it out once more. Do not listen to the song. Do not look into the abyss. For the abyss is always looking back.
The following tale is one of shadowed halls, whispered madness, and the cold touch of fate. It begins with a man ensnared by the echoes of his own dread, and it shall end with the revelation of what truly haunts the living. It was in the winter of my soul when I first set foot within the mansion that stood isolated upon the craggy cliffs overlooking the churning sea. The wind was a low, mournful wail that seemed to come not from the earth but from deep within the house itself, whispering forgotten secrets to those who dared to listen. It was an abode as sinister as it was magnificent, a sprawling edifice of decaying stone, wrought iron and glass that reflected only the empty sky. I had come not as a guest but as a seeker, drawn by rumors of its cursed past and by the desperate need to know the nature of the affliction that had claimed the late Lord Blackthorn. My arrival was met with the gaping silence of abandoned halls, save for the scurrying of unseen vermin that flitted through the shadows. I entered, and the door creaked shut behind me as though it were the last breath of a dying man. The air was thick with the scent of must and decay, mingling with the faint trace of something more metallic, a smell that spoke of blood and suffering. I wandered through rooms that spoke of a long-forgotten opulence, grand fireplaces with their flaking marbles, gilded mirrors that warped the reflection of a man not wholly himself, and portraits of grim ancestors whose eyes followed me wherever I went. Their gnarled visages seemed to leer with contempt or warn of some unspeakable terror. Yet it was not the specters of the past that I feared most. It was the chill of something else, something that seemed to stir as I made my way deeper into the belly of the house. As night fell and the wind howled louder, I entered a chamber at the far end of the eastern wing, a place that had not been part of the estate's original blueprints. It was a room that no visitor would have chosen to see, yet it was the very room that I was drawn to, as if an unseen hand had beckoned me to the heart of the house. The floorboards groaned in protest beneath my steps, and the walls, covered in peeling wallpaper, bore the grim traces of a recent and frantic struggle. But it was the small, iron-bound door at the far end of the chamber that claimed my attention. The handle was cold as death itself, and when I turned it, a sound echoed, a deep, resonant clang that seemed to come not from the hinges but from somewhere within. I hesitated, but curiosity pushed me forward. The room beyond was empty but for an ancient, crumbling pedestal in the center, and atop it, an object wrapped in a blood-red cloth. A deep dread settled in my gut as I stepped into the room, the air around me pressing down like an unseen weight. I reached out to the cloth, my fingers trembling, and drew it away, revealing a skull, pale and cracked, its empty eye sockets black as midnight. I stumbled back, my mind screaming that this was not just a relic, it was a vessel, a fragment of something that had never truly left this world. The eyes seemed to glisten, and an unnatural shiver coursed through my spine. "Who dares disturb me?" The voice came from behind, cold and resonant, yet layered with echoes as though countless others spoke through it. I spun around, but the room was empty, silent save for the slow drip-drip of a leak somewhere in the corner. The skull's gaze fixed upon me, and suddenly I was no longer alone. The whispered agony of voices long silenced filled the air, voices that spoke of betrayal, love lost, and the piercing chill of finality. The shadows in the corners stretched and coalesced, forming shapes that seemed to watch and wait. And then, through the cacophony of voices, one word stood clear, spoken in a tone that was both triumphant and tormented. "Return." The skull grinned, its teeth sharp and gleaming, and I realized too late that I had not discovered the mansion's secret. I had become it. The wind outside ceased as though the world itself held its breath, and the whispered warnings of the portraits and echoes of past nightmares were no longer warnings but promises. As the light from the single guttering candle waned and the darkness surged, I knew I had become the last of Lord Blackthorn's haunted lineage. I would remain here, in this prison of stone and shadow, never to escape the madness that now claimed me.
The dusk settled over the coastal town of Black Hollow like a funeral shroud, the sun dipping behind the jagged cliffs in a crimson blaze that seemed to bleed into the churning, Black Sea. Edwin Price stood at the edge of the old, weather-beaten dock, staring out at the endless expanse of water. The salt air stung his lungs, carrying with it whispers that tangled with the wind, a haunting susurrus that spoke of ancient things waiting beneath the waves. Edwin had never been one to indulge in local superstitions, He was a man of logic, a chemist with an eye for the tangible. Yet, there was something in the murmur of the sea tonight that scratched at the edges of his reason, urging him to heed warnings he'd dismissed as folklore. The townspeople spoke of strange disappearances, of sailors who'd ventured out beyond the reach of the lighthouse and returned either missing or changed. The words of Old Man Holloway echoed in his mind, an unbidden refrain. "Beware the deep, for it holds the hunger of gods." He scoffed, pushing the memory aside. The old man had been half mad, speaking of creatures with eyes like molten gold and whispers that could shatter the mind. But tonight, as the sea lapped against the wooden pylons of the dock, Edwin felt the weight of that warning press against him like a phantom's touch. A sharp crack from the darkened pier behind him snapped Edwin from his reverie. He spun around, the thumping of his heart loud in his ears. The dock was empty, shadows dancing like phantoms at the far end where the moonlight dared not reach. "Just the wood," he muttered, forcing a chuckle. He turned back to the sea, only to find that the water seemed different, dark and roiling as though stirred by some unseen leviathan. Then he saw it, a glimmer beneath the surface, a flicker that resembled a silhouette, as if the water itself had become a living thing. The sudden, suffocating silence that followed made the air feel heavy and unbreathable. The night seemed to hold its breath. Edwin's mind, driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, reached for the lantern at his side, casting a shaky light across the dock. He stared out at the black, undulating surface, the faint glow of the lighthouse flickering in the distance, a solitary sentinel against the ever-consuming dark. Something shifted beneath the waves, a colossal form that sent a ripple through the water, warping the moon's reflection like a mirror shattered by an unseen hand. Edwin's heart pounded in his chest as the water roiled and churned, twisting into a shape that defied both reason and nature. The glistening blackness was punctuated by what looked like enormous, sinuous appendages that broke the surface, dripping with a slick, inky fluid. He stumbled backward, nearly losing his footing as the lantern swayed dangerously in his trembling hand. The light sputtered, casting eerie, fractured beams that danced across the shifting sea and the stark, aged wood of the dock. A deep, resonant hum rose from the depths, vibrating through the planks beneath his feet and resonating in his bones. The sound was neither animal nor mechanical. It was the voice of something ancient, something that had waited eons beneath the fathomless waters. Edwin's breath quickened, and he fought the urge to scream, to flee, but his legs seemed to have been turned to lead. The creature's head broke the surface, an undulating monstrosity crowned with what seemed to be a dozen eyes, each one gleaming like black marbles set into a grotesque mask. But it was the mouth that stole the breath from Edwin's lungs, a jagged gaping maw lined with teeth like obsidian blades, each one serrated and curved like the claws of a predator. It opened, emitting a roar that made the very sea shudder and the wind carry with it a chorus of deep, guttural chants that seemed to echo from the pit of creation itself. Edwin's vision blurred as the shock set in, the world around him narrowing to a pinpoint focus on that monstrous sight. For a moment, he felt as though he was suspended between realms, caught between the mortal world and some unfathomable, eldritch abyss. The whispers of Old Man Holloway returned, no longer distant and inconsequential but loud, urgent, and real. The hunger of gods. The creature's appendages lashed out, the sea splitting and hissing as tendrils of obsidian reached toward him, shimmering with an otherworldly, metallic sheen. Edwin staggered backward, desperately trying to pull himself away from the grasping darkness, but it was too late. One of the tentacles coiled around his leg, the pressure like iron chains and slick, cold slime wrapping around him, holding him fast. His screams were lost to the wind as the creature's eyes fixed upon him, a dozen unblinking, merciless orbs that seemed to peer into his very soul. The terror was overwhelming, a primal fear that clawed at his insides and made him long for the oblivion of unconsciousness. But he could not look away, could not shut his eyes to the truth that now threatened to consume him. He was nothing more than a plaything for the ancient, unknowable horrors of the deep. The tentacle tightened, lifting him from the dock as easily as a man might lift a child. His screams echoed against the cliffs, unheard and unanswered, as the cold, dark water rushed up to meet him. And then, there was only the inky void of the abyss, the crushing pressure of the sea, and the feeling of 1,000 unseen eyes upon him, a chorus of whispers promising a fate worse than death. The sensation was like being swallowed by a black hole, a terrible weight pressing against his chest, stealing the air from his lungs. Edwin's limbs flailed uselessly as he sank deeper into the frigid, choking dark. The lantern, still clutched in his white-knuckled hand, sputtered and went out, plunging him into an even Mars profound void. Suddenly, the grip around his leg released, but he did not fall. The water churned and twisted, and a terrible current yanked him toward the depths. His vision blurred with salt and darkness, and the taste of brine burned his throat as he gasped. He felt his body being dragged, drawn into the very marrow of the ocean. All the while, the humming, the low thrumming that resonated from the creature above, grew louder, shaking the ocean floor itself. Edwin's mind reeled, teetering on the edge of consciousness, but something new caught his attention: the glint of light deep below. It was an unnatural, pulsing glow, like fireflies dancing in the uncharted black, but infinitely more menacing. As he was pulled toward the source, the darkness seemed to shift, revealing jagged spires of rock and grotesque formations that appeared to pulsate as if alive. The glow intensified, blinding him momentarily before giving way to shapes that defied geometry, a mind-shattering tableau of writhing, living stone. The whispers in his mind grew louder, now impossible to ignore. They were words, but not words he could comprehend. They echoed in the darkness, a cacophony of alien sounds that vibrated in his bones. Then, as if an unseen tide had pulled back to reveal some dark secret, Edwin saw it. A temple carved from obsidian and bone, covered in carvings that shifted and reformed before his eyes. Figures half human, half something else, stood frozen in poses of horror, their eyes wide and staring as if captured in eternal agony. He gasped, realizing the truth too late. This was no place meant for man. This was not a secret treasure of lost civilization, but a prison, a tomb. It was a place where the gods that had long been forgotten had been sealed away, kept in slumber by rites older than any written history. And now, they had awoken. From within the temple, a figure emerged, though to call it a figure was to insult the notion of form itself. It was a shifting, gnarled mass that oozed and twisted like a living nightmare, eyes scattered across its surface like constellations of black, glistening pearls. Tendrils writhed from its center, each ending in a mouth that muttered forgotten prayers and gurgled in a language Edwin knew he was not meant to understand. Edwin, it rasped, a voice both terrible and familiar, the chosen. He felt his body go numb. His senses screamed in protest, his heart pounding against the walls of his chest as if trying to break free. The creature's tendrils coiled around him once more, but now there was no struggle. He knew that his flesh was not his own, his soul already binding to an ancient, unforgiving force. The whispers crescendoed into a roar, louder than any sound Edwin had ever known. His mind splintered under the weight of its call, every piece of his being drawn into the light of that accursed temple. The darkness shifted, forming new shapes that seemed to swell and breathe, revealing faces contorted in agony, eyes wide and searching for salvation that would never come. The ocean was no longer just water. It was a sea of eyes, reflecting the nightmare that Edwin had become a part of. His screams were drowned in the growing symphony of inhuman cries. For just a moment, time ceased. The sea seemed to hold its breath, and then the temple let out a low, resonant pulse. Edwin's vision blurred with a sudden rush of pain, and he gasped, as if coming up for air that would never come. The creature's form surged around him, melding into him, whispering in that same ancient tongue. And then, silence. The current stilled, as if the heartbeat of the world had paused. But in the blackness that surrounded him, Edwin felt a change, a shift so subtle and cold that it seemed to seep into the marrow of his bones. He could no longer feel his body. It was as if he had become part of the dark itself. The whispers, now a unified voice, echoed in the empty vastness, promising that their hunger would never wane. Out in the open sea, a ripple spread outward from the temple's remains, expanding like the reach of an unseen, insidious hand. And far, far beyond the limits of human understanding, something that had been waiting for millennia stirred. The ocean was not a prison for secrets. It was their home, and soon, it would be their dominion. The weight of the silence grew as Elias sat in the center of the room, the pale light of the lantern casting sharp, trembling shadows across the cracked walls. The whispers had subsided for a time, but now they stirred again, a chorus of distant murmurs that seemed to resonate from the very stones beneath him. He clutched the ancient, weathered tome tighter, its binding creaking under his grip. The symbols had carved themselves into his mind, their dark meanings now woven into the fabric of his consciousness. A sudden shift in the air prickled his skin, cold and sharp as a blade. Elias felt a tremor in the ground beneath him, subtle at first, but growing in strength until the room itself seemed to shudder with a pulse that mirrored his own racing heartbeat. His lantern sputtered, the flame quivering as if straining against an unseen force. In the flickering light, the mural of the elder being seemed to shift. Its eyes, wide and unblinking, began to glisten with a terrible, otherworldly hunger. He had come seeking answers, a path to power that could change the course of human destiny. But now, the price of his ambition was becoming all too clear. The air thickened, suffused with the scent of old, wet earth and something more primal, something that clawed at the back of his mind, whispering promises of unending knowledge at the cost of his sanity. A shudder passed through Elias as he turned the pages of the tome, half unconscious, the words aligning themselves in his vision as if painted with blood. "Awaken, sleeper of the abyss," he read aloud, the syllables curling in his throat like a snake. The room spun around him, colors bleeding together in a grotesque dance, and then, without warning, there was a sound, a deep, guttural rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very marrow of his bones. The floor split open, jagged cracks snaking out like the roots of a malevolent tree, and from the fissure poured an inky, churning mist. It coalesced into a shape, a form that defied comprehension. At first, it was only the vaguest outline, a shifting mass of tendrils, each one slick and wet, wrapping around themselves as if alive, whispering and hissing in a language Elias could not begin to understand. And then it emerged fully, filling the room with a presence so dark and vast that Elias was overcome with a primal, soul-deep terror. It was as if the boundaries between the material world and the beyond had been torn asunder. The being loomed, its form impossible to fully grasp, a writhing amalgamation of eyes, mouths, and appendages that defied all natural laws. Each eye blinked and stared, 1,000 gazes piercing through him, seeing into the deepest corners of his mind where even he dared not tread. For a moment, the whispers fell silent, as if holding their breath. Then, the creature spoke, not with a voice, but with a thunderous, bone-shaking rumble that seemed to echo in the hollow of his soul. "You have awakened me, and now I shall show you." Elias wanted to scream, to tear his eyes away, but his body was locked, his limbs unresponsive. The room seemed to collapse in around him as the creature moved, its tendrils reaching out, their slick, cold surface brushing against him, leaving a trail of ice where they touched. The tome fell from his hand, landing with a sickening thud at his feet. The creature shifted, eyes narrowing as its many mouths began to open, revealing rows of sharp, glistening teeth and tongues that lashed out like whips. The air grew heavy, and Elias felt his heart struggle to beat as if it, too, feared what was coming next. "The price of knowledge is always paid in blood," it whispered, and the sound of its voice was not a sound at all but the vibration of the universe itself. Elias's vision began to dim, and in that moment, he knew that he had become part of something far older and more terrifying than the world had ever known. The room became a maelstrom of darkness, and the last thing he saw before the light finally left his eyes was the shadowed form of the creature reaching out to claim him, its eyes wide and gaping as they swallowed his mind whole. The darkness was thick and stifling, pressing against Elias like a physical force. He was no longer aware of his body, his senses stripped away as if torn from him by unseen hands. The creature's voice rumbled in the silence, a sound that seemed to exist beyond the boundaries of time and space, and then he felt the first tendril wrap around his mind, cold, sinuous, and pulsing with a rhythm that was not his own. His vision fragmented into a kaleidoscope of memories and visions, each more terrifying than the last. He was no longer in the dimly lit chamber of the ancient ruin. He stood on the edge of an endless void, surrounded by whispering, writhing figures that formed shapes half seen and yet familiar. His own voice echoed in the emptiness, but it was distorted, hollow and strange. "You are part of the cycle now, Elias," came the voice of the creature, a symphony of countless tongues twisted into one. He felt his soul unravel as the memories came flooding back, memories of ancient rituals, of forbidden knowledge exchanged in the dead of night, and the binding of beings older than the stars themselves. Suddenly, the visions fell away, and Elias was thrust back into the room. The floor was no longer stone but a writhing mass of darkness, a living chasm that seemed to breathe. The creature's eyes multiplied, filling the room with their otherworldly light, a light that burned not with fire but with the icy cold of the void. Elias's breath came in gasps, but he could not scream. His voice had been stolen, torn from him as he had been torn from his own reality. The tendrils retracted, slithering back into the creature's form, but the darkness did not retreat. It grew denser, its weight pressing against Elias's chest until he thought he would burst. The whispers returned, louder now, an unbearable chorus of anguish and ecstasy, praising and cursing in the same breath. "You have glimpsed the edge," the creature spoke again, its form shifting as if it were being seen from multiple angles at once. The voices of those who had dared to peer into the abyss rose behind it, pleading and screaming, voices of scholars who had long since vanished into obscurity, of madmen who had sold their sanity for a moment's truth. And now, Elias was one of them. He felt a sharp pain in his mind, a fissure cracking open where his thoughts had once been coherent. The tome at his feet fluttered, its pages rustling as though a wind had passed through it. The ancient symbols now alive, dancing and shifting. Words he had never read before filled his vision, a mantra that resonated with his very being. The path is open, the journey begun. Elias's vision split and spun, his mind fraying at the edges as he felt his consciousness unravel. What he saw was more horrifying than the creature itself. Visions of himself, lifeless and draped in the shroud of eternity, eyes wide and staring as if in eternal, knowing terror. The ground beneath him began to shift, rupturing in dark waves that spread out like veins, flowing around his feet and up his legs. He could not move, could not flee, as the darkness rose higher, enveloping him in a cold embrace. His heart thundered, a frantic drumbeat as the creature's true form began to take shape. The walls of the chamber creaked and split, revealing glimpses of the world beyond. A world not of earth or sky, but of starlit horrors, of realms where the laws of physics held no sway, where beings of unimaginable power waged wars that tore the fabric of reality apart. Elias knew then that he was no longer just a man. He was a conduit, a vessel for something far more powerful and malevolent than he could comprehend. And as the last of his sanity peeled away, the creature's voice pierced the abyss of his mind. The cycle has begun anew. The whispers were now a roar, a deafening cacophony that filled the chamber and beyond. The last vestiges of Elias's will splintered, replaced by the dark realization that there was no escape, no sanctuary. He had crossed a threshold from which there was no return, and the horrors that awaited him were only the beginning of the dark legacy he had set in motion. And as the darkness swallowed him whole, he was no longer afraid. He was a part of it now, and the world outside would never be the same again. The air was still, yet heavy, as though the very fabric of reality had been bent and warped by the unspeakable forces that surrounded him. Elias felt his heart, once a steady drumbeat, now frenzied and unrecognizable, like a broken machine sputtering its last, desperate gasps. The chamber was no longer a confined space. It had expanded into a landscape of shifting, pulsating shadows. The walls had melted away into a rolling sea of black that stretched infinitely, broken only by the distant, flickering light of stars that hung like dying embers. A shudder passed through Elias, a tremor that started in his core and rippled outward. His body felt alien to him, the limbs he had once known now heavy and disconnected, as if they had been replaced with the living shadow of himself. The creature, or whatever it had become, loomed before him, its many eyes wide and unblinking, shifting like liquid mercury. Its form seemed to pulse with life, a rhythm so chaotic and beyond the understanding of man that it defied logic. The herald comes, the voice rumbled, not with words, but with the deep resonance of thought that echoed directly into Elias's mind, speaking in a language older than the stars themselves. It was a call to something, some entity that existed far beyond his comprehension, something that stirred within the darkest voids of the universe. The ground trembled beneath his feet as he stared into the abyssal light of the creature's eyes, and he realized with a sickening jolt that he had become aware of his own pulse, slow and labored, as though it were the last whisper of life clinging to his soul. The whispers grew louder, no longer just a chorus of madness but now individual voices, each distinct, each imploring him to remember. They spoke of power and corruption, of the price of forbidden knowledge, of sacrifices made long before his time. He reached out a hand, desperate, shaking, and touched the surface of the shifting darkness around him. It was neither warm nor cold but something in between, an unnatural sensation that numbed his fingers. The touch seemed to awaken something within the void, as if it were a living entity, hungry and yearning. A sharp, searing pain cut through his chest, and he gasped, unable to breathe, unable to scream. He felt as though his very essence were being torn from him, a rending so profound it left him feeling hollow and adrift. And then, with a surge that stole what little was left of his will, the realization struck him: he was not alone. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, and before him, in the undulating sea of darkness, a new form began to take shape. It was a figure, tall and thin, its silhouette grotesque, and yet oddly familiar. Its eyes were pools of dark light, and as it emerged, Elias felt a terrible, unearthly recognition seep into him. He knew this being. It was one of the ancients, one of the heralds that had come before and would come again, always seeking, always demanding. It was the origin of the stories he had dismissed as madness, cults, rituals, the whispers in the dark that spoke of cosmic truths hidden in the folds of reality. It had been the focus of 1,000 nightmares, but now it was no longer a shadow of his imagination. It was real and reaching out, not just to him, but to the world beyond. The figure raised a long, skeletal hand, and the darkness surged forward, a living tide that embraced Elias and pulled him deeper into its folds. He struggled, clawed at the nothingness, but it was no use. The stars overhead flickered as if in fear, as if the universe itself were gasping in anticipation of what was to come. He felt his mind splitting again, this time in a way that he knew was final. The room, the chamber, the dark sea, all began to dissolve into a singularity of black that would consume everything. But as he gave in to the pull, he heard the creature's voice one last time, a whisper so profound it cut through the silence like a blade. The void embraces all. Remember, little one. In the end, all will belong to the dark. The darkness folded over him, and for a brief, shuddering moment, he was nothing. In the void, time lost all meaning. Elias was no longer sure if he was still a man or just a fragment of consciousness, drifting between realms of reality and the unspeakable. The deep hum of the dark being pulsed around him, vibrating against what remained of his mind like a terrible chorus of alien notes. The whispers became louder again, coalescing into fragmented words and commands that tormented him with a mix of dread and curiosity. He became aware that he was moving, not by his own volition, but drawn along a path carved by the creature's will. The abyss was parting, forming a rift that seemed to pierce into another world. Shadows coiled in a dance of horror, stretching toward a new, nightmarish place. Shapes beyond human comprehension flickered at the edges of his vision, shapes that were neither solid nor liquid, but something far worse, an existence that had no right to be. Elias's eyes widened as he realized that he was no longer alone. Figures appeared in the periphery, their forms monstrous and writhing, half-formed in the darkness. They were creatures that defied anatomy, beings with too many limbs, eyes that wept glistening black tears, and mouths that whispered forgotten languages. Their presence filled the rift with an electric anticipation that gnawed at him, urging him to understand, to remember, to join them in their hunger for knowledge and chaos. A sudden jolt ran through his body as he felt himself being pulled forward. The darkness around him was no longer just an empty, suffocating void. It had become a threshold, a veil between worlds, and he was teetering on the edge. The echoes of the past, of people he had known, of voices he had dismissed as madness, surged up to meet him. Faces flickered before his eyes, distorted and distorted, whispering tales of greed and consequence, of those who had dared to look beyond the known and had been lost in the unfathomable. Suddenly, a familiar voice broke through the tumult, a voice he had long forgotten. It was his own, calling out from the deepest recesses of his mind. "You were warned, Elias. You were warned of the price." The realization hit him like a crashing wave. He had come seeking answers, but what he found now was beyond even his darkest dreams. He was not just a spectator but an agent, a chosen vessel for the creature's designs. The power that had called him was not to be denied, but neither could he reconcile with the truth that he was now a part of it, a thread woven into an incomprehensible tapestry of existence. The creature spoke again, but this time in a voice that resonated with a strange familiarity. It spoke in the language of fear and submission, in a tongue that tickled the edges of his sanity and forced him to remember everything he had ever wanted to forget. "You have seen what lies beneath, Elias. Now you must become it." With a last surge of terror, Elias's body convulsed as he was pulled further into the rift. It was no longer just the creature that enveloped him but an entire collective of beings, an eldritch consciousness that reached out with grasping tendrils of thought and will. He felt himself bending and warping, his form shifting between human and something else, something ancient, hungry, and bound to a destiny he could neither accept nor deny. The last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed him was a flash of light, bright and pure, a sliver of hope that quickly dimmed and then extinguished, leaving only the void. The rift closed behind him, sealing him within the prison of a world where no human had ever set foot, where the fabric of space and time warped into shapes that could not be named, only felt. As the light dimmed and the last vestiges of Elias's humanity were consumed by the alien abyss, a profound silence fell over the expanse. The whispers ceased, the cacophony of nightmarish voices dissolved into a single, all-encompassing hum, one that thrummed with the pulse of infinite knowledge and anguish. The creatures, if they could be called such, shifted in the darkness, as if settling into a new form, their hunger sated for now. Elias stood at the center of this world, no longer a man but an echo, a vessel. The memories of his life clung to him like shadows, flickering and fading, lost to the thrall of the being that had taken hold of him. The hunger that now coursed through him was insatiable, a thirst for understanding that bordered on madness. He knew that he was not alone. The minds of others who had fallen before him now mingled with his own, an unholy communion of fear, ambition, and forgotten names. The creature spoke, its voice now a chorus of every broken soul that had ever dared to seek beyond the veil. The language it used was an ancient dialect, spoken in syllables that stirred the deepest part of him. It whispered of things yet to come, of a world shrouded in secrets, where shadows were alive and light was a lie. The promise of knowledge was both a gift and a curse, one that would never be returned to its mortal bounds. Elias turned, a soundless cry escaping him as he looked into the shimmering expanse that had once been the mundane world of man. From this place, he could see Earth as a distant sphere, a fragile blue gem surrounded by the cold, unfeeling abyss. His mind, now a fractured mirror, reflected glimpses of the lives that had yet to be touched by the entity's influence. The whispers swelled once more, wrapping around him with a mixture of reverence and dread. There was no going back, not now. He felt the dark gift settle into the depths of his being, altering his thoughts and memories, intertwining him with the abyssal will that had called him forth. He had become both witness and participant in the unfathomable. And so, as the veil between worlds grew ever thinner, Elias knew that he would not be the last to find this place. Those who dared to seek, those who sought answers beyond the realm of man, would be drawn into this eternal dance, this unending torment of cosmic revelation. The world would change, and in its dark heart, the voice of Elias, now an echo in the dark, whispered a single, chilling truth: the abyss does not forget, and it remembers.
In the realm where shadows stretch and silence holds dominion, there are those who wander, seeking the pulse beneath the surface. This tale is not for the faint-hearted, for it speaks of decay, of a soul's fracture, and of the cost of peering into the abyss. I came upon the old house on a night when the moon was little more than a jagged scar across the sky. It crouched at the edge of the forest, a broken thing that seemed to groan under the weight of its own existence, walls splintered and paint peeling like the skin of a leper. Rumors claimed it was haunted, a nursery for phantoms who murmured through the dark. But I had not come to listen to stories. I had come for answers, answers that the world outside dared not utter. The entrance creaked as I pushed it open, the hinges singing like the bones of a forsaken creature. The hallway within was a narrow corridor of suffocating gloom, the air heavy with the scent of old smoke and the tang of decay. The floorboards, warped and brittle, cradled my footsteps with a groan that resonated in my chest. I felt as though I were walking on the spine of a dying thing, each step an act of betrayal against its tired body. A flickering light beckoned from a room at the end of the hall, trembling like a heartbeat. I approached, each movement wrapped in the tar-like weight of dread. Inside, the candle sputtered, casting twisted shadows that clawed up the walls and tangled in the cobwebbed corners. And there, seated before an ancient mirror, was a figure draped in the tattered shroud of silence. Their face was obscured, but their presence reeked of loss and defiance, as if the reflection in the glass was not one of flesh but of something far older and hungrier. "Do you see them?" a voice rasped, sharp as broken glass. It was not a question but an invitation. I stepped closer and the air thickened, pressing against my chest as if I were drowning. The mirror did not show my own reflection. Instead, it revealed a parade of eyes, thousands of them, winking, watching, and pleading. They blinked open and shut in an endless cycle, each one a story of suffering carved into bone and blood. I realized then that I was not seeing through the glass. The glass was seeing through me, pulling forth the filaments of my soul. "Are you afraid?" the voice whispered, this time softer, as if the house itself held its breath. I turned to flee, but the hallway twisted, its edges curling in upon themselves until I was no longer sure which way was home. The wood splintered into snarling mouths. The walls grew veins that throbbed and pulsed with the rhythm of a dark, ancient heart. I stumbled and fell, landing with a thud that split the silence and fractured my vision. The ground was no longer solid, but a sea of dark water, slick and oily, and it laughed as I floundered, its laughter a cacophony that stung my ears. The air was now choked with an electric charge, a static that made the hairs on my arms rise. I reached for the edge of the room, where a faint shimmer of light still trembled, and clawed my way through the tumult, fingers scraping against the rough wood. The floor beneath me gave way, plunging me into darkness, and I fell into an abyss that tasted of ash and iron. Time became a loop, an endless reel with missing frames. I was no longer a man but a wisp, a ripple in the vast ocean of whispers. I could hear them all now, the voices of those who had come before, who had touched the same mirror, whose eyes had blinked open and shut like marionettes tangled in their own strings. They spoke of longing and betrayal, of a truth that resided not in the world above, but in the underbelly of existence, where the line between life and death thinned until it was no more than a gossamer thread. "Why do you look?" they chanted, their voices like 100 blades scraping against stone. "What do you seek in the dark, where even the light dares not linger?" The room twisted again, and I was standing in the hallway once more, the mirror now cracked and leaking shadows. A grotesque figure emerged from it, a silhouette of limbs stretched too far, eyes that glistened with a madness that mirrored my own. The figure did not speak, but its presence spoke volumes, a riddle I could not solve. "I did not seek this," I whispered, and my voice echoed back at me, distorted and broken. The floor groaned, and the walls splintered, as if in recognition of the truth. The house, alive with memories and hunger, was no longer an inanimate thing. It was a living cathedral of anguish, each creak and shudder a prayer for salvation, or perhaps for damnation. I turned to the mirror, now a shattered mosaic of silvery fragments. Through them, I could see the hollow of my own eyes, staring back at me, hollow and haunted. The darkness was no longer an enemy, but an embrace, and I knew then that I would never leave this place. I would become another whisper, another cautionary tale for those who dared to wander, a voice lost among the multitude of eyes that waited in the gloom. The last light flickered and died, leaving me in the abyss with the eyes and the echoes, the remnants of a man who had once dared to look too closely.
The rain pelted the cobblestone streets of Black Hollow like a staccato of sinister applause. It was a town of dark alleys and even darker whispers, nestled between a landscape that seemed to stretch forever in a sea of twisted oaks and ever-dreary fog. In Black Hollow, the sun was a guest so rare that the people who lived there would speak of its glow as if it were a tale from another world, one of warmth and reason, so removed from the endless cold that clutched the earth. Jonathan Wilkes was a scholar of antiquities, though that title was a facade he wore to cover the truth. In reality, he was a seeker of secrets, a man driven by an insatiable hunger for knowledge that no conventional means could satisfy. The vast tomes that lined the walls of his chamber, each inscribed with symbols that wriggled and squirmed as the firelight flickered, were a testament to this obsession. But it was not until the letter arrived, sealed with an enigmatic crimson wax and scrawled in a hand that looked as if it were more ink than flesh, that the true extent of his madness began to take shape. The letter read, "Come to the hollow chapel at the stroke of midnight. There, beneath the altar of shadows, you shall see what lies beyond." Jonathan's breath caught in his throat as he read it again, the parchment shaking in his fingers. The chapel was a ruin on the edge of town, a place where whispered legends said the townsfolk would go to speak with ghosts. But Jonathan, a man of logic and the known, scoffed at such tales. Until now, the wind howled like a mourning banshee as he made his way through the night. The narrow streets were slick with rain, and every creak of the old timbers that made up the town's ancient buildings felt like the groan of an ancient being waking from slumber. Black Hollow held its breath, waiting. He stood before the chapel, its once grand stone facade now draped in ivy and mildew. Time had not been kind, and neither had the decades of rumors that kept it as dark as the abyss itself. Yet, Jonathan entered without hesitation, driven by a force he could not name, an irresistible pull that resonated within his bones. The air inside was thick, charged with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic and ancient, like the first breaths of creation. At the center of the room, the altar loomed, its surface carved with grotesque figures that seemed to shift when viewed from the corner of the eye. Above it, a stained glass window depicted scenes of cosmic horror, great tentacled beings clawing at the heavens, faces frozen in expressions of horror, and the skeletal remains of a forgotten god. Jonathan reached for the altar with trembling hands, feeling the smooth, cold stone under his fingertips. And then, from deep within the chapel, a sound began, a low, guttural vibration that rattled the stones and crawled up his spine. It was a noise that suggested existence itself was quivering. A voice, soft and insidious, whispered his name. Jonathan. He spun around, eyes wide and heart pounding like a drum of war. The shadows in the chapel seemed to shift, breaking apart and coalescing into something unholy. From the darkness, a figure emerged, robed in garments that seemed woven from the night itself. Its face was obscured by a cowl, but Jonathan felt its gaze, a pressure against his mind that left him breathless. "You have come," the voice spoke, echoing through the chamber like a chant, mingling with the sound of the wind outside. "Who are you?" Jonathan stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "An observer," came the reply, "a witness to that which should never be known." Jonathan's gaze dropped to the floor, where a series of ancient runes had been carved into the stone in a pattern that seemed to form a path leading into darkness. The light of the torches around the room sputtered, their flames leaning away as if repelled by what lay ahead. "What is this?" Jonathan demanded, his voice laced with fear. "A gift," the figure replied. "And a warning." Suddenly, the air trembled, and Jonathan stumbled backward as a low moan rose from beneath the altar. The earth cracked, and the runes glowed with a sickly, pulsating light. He fell to his knees as the stone before him cracked apart, revealing a pit that seemed to descend endlessly into the dark. From its depths, a voice called out, not in words, but in a deep, resounding vibration that seemed to speak directly to his mind. "The eye sees all," it intoned. "The void welcomes those who seek beyond." Jonathan felt his vision blur, the room spinning as though he were caught in the grip of an unseen cyclone. His mind screamed at him to run, but his body was frozen. The figure above him raised its arm, and from the sleeve of its robe, a thin tendril, black as a raven's wing, reached out and touched the center of his forehead. Pain exploded in Jonathan's head, raw and searing. The chapel, the town of Black Hollow, and everything he had ever known faded into an abyss of agony. Images flooded his mind, visions of stars so distant they were almost dreams, of creatures with eyes as wide as oceans and teeth that devoured reality itself. He saw a place where time had no meaning and space was but a canvas for horrors unspeakable. "You have been chosen," the figure said, its voice now a chorus of 1,000 whispers, "to witness the truth that none dare seek." And then, Jonathan Wilkes felt himself slipping, his senses dissolving into a darkness so absolute that it seemed to devour even the echo of his own scream. Jonathan's awareness returned in fits and spurts, like a flickering flame in a windstorm. The darkness was still there, suffocating and absolute, but it was now interlaced with fleeting images, glimpses of shapes beyond comprehension, of eyes that stared with an unblinking, all-seeing gaze. He was no longer in the chapel. He was somewhere far removed, somewhere that existed in a place where reality and nightmare intertwined. He found himself suspended, weightless, yet crushed under a weight that defied reason. The echoes of the chanting voices surrounded him, each one a note of torment and revelation. With an effort that seemed to drain the last reserves of his will, Jonathan forced his eyes open. But there was no chapel, no altar, and no figure shrouded in black. He was in an expanse that seemed to stretch forever, an abyss of shifting shadows and glistening, iridescent tendrils that reached out to him, brushing against his mind with unseen fingers. "Jonathan Wilkes," came the voice, now softer, almost sympathetic. "Do you see now?" He tried to respond, but no sound escaped his lips. His body was no longer his own. It was a vessel caught between realms, tethered by the fragile strands of his sanity. Before him, a great, cyclopean shape emerged, not in any form that the human eye could truly recognize, but an amalgamation of horror and beauty that defied description. It was an ancient god, its singular eye the size of a great chasm, filled with depths that threatened to consume his mind. The eye blinked, and with that motion, the expanse shifted, a ripple passing through the darkness that made Jonathan's soul quiver. "You have seen what lies beyond the known," the voice continued, now growing stronger, more corporeal. "You have glimpsed the true nature of existence. Do you not feel it, the rush of understanding?" A shudder racked his frame, but the response was silent. Yet, he felt it, an electric current coursing through him, sparking memories that were not his own. Memories of impossible lands, of gods that were born from the void and perished in the light of stars. The image of the altar in Black Hollow was a mere whisper compared to this, a shadow of what his mind now processed. "I am the last witness of the eldritch epoch," the voice said, resonating in the vast expanse, filling every fiber of Jonathan's being. "Those who seek truth beyond the mortal coil pay the price of their sanity. Your journey has only just begun." Jonathan's vision wavered as an unbearable light erupted from the center of the abyss, a light that blazed and shifted in an array of colors that no human eye could process. He screamed, or at least he thought he did. His voice was lost in the cacophony, swallowed by the screams of forgotten beings and the eternal murmurs of the abyss. Time, if it could be called that, seemed to fold upon itself. Jonathan saw flashes of his life, memories that grew foreign, tainted by cosmic truths. The face of his mother, her gentle eyes now twisted into a grimace of unknowing horror. The library where he had once read tales of forbidden lore, now a cathedral of madness where tomes bled black ink that dripped like the tears of an ancient, forgotten god. He was drowning in revelations, unable to decipher where he ended and the madness began. The voice spoke again, now like a chorus of 1,000 lost souls. "To bear witness is to surrender. To seek truth is to be consumed. Do you understand, Jonathan?" With a final, desperate shudder, Jonathan felt himself being pulled back, wrenched from the abyss as if by some unseen force. He was no longer surrounded by a realm of eternal dark, but by the suffocating silence of his chamber in Black Hollow. The walls, once lined with relics of forgotten knowledge, now stood as empty sentinels, their cracked surfaces reflecting a grim truth. He gasped for breath, his body trembling, the echoes of alien voices still reverberating in his ears. His mind reeled as he tried to reconcile the reality before him with the visions that had clawed at the edges of his consciousness. There was no doubt now. He had seen the true face of existence, and it was monstrous. But the voice was still there, deep within his mind, a whisper that was neither reassuring nor kind. "You have seen the truth, Jonathan Wilkes. And now, it sees you." Jonathan fell to the floor, a broken man, his sanity stripped raw and exposed. Outside, the rain continued its ceaseless descent, the sound like a hollow laugh, as if Black Hollow itself were mocking him, a town that had always known the price of curiosity. And, deep within the dark, the eye watched and waited, waiting for the next fool to stumble upon the hollow altar, to peer into the unknown and find there, staring back, an ancient, unspeakable truth. Jonathan's trembling hands reached out, clutching the edge of the wooden desk as if it were the only thing tethering him to this reality. His breaths came in ragged, shallow gasps, the rhythmic pounding of his heart sounding like a drumbeat of madness. The whispers in his mind had grown louder, morphing into a chorus of chittering voices that spoke in tongues older than time. He pressed his palms hard against his temples, trying to block out the cacophony, to drown out the cold, distant laughter that seemed to echo through the chamber. Outside, the storm raged on, the wind howling like a chorus of the damned. The trees creaked and groaned, their limbs twisting in defiance against the storm's cruel embrace. The rain lashed against the windows, blurring the line between what was inside and what was out. But it was not just the storm that made Jonathan shiver. The air around him felt charged, almost alive with a pulsing, electric tension that prickled his skin like the approach of a predator. A sharp knock at the door shattered the madness that clawed at him, drawing his gaze upward with a start. It was an unearthly sound, sharp and final, as if a hand made of bone and shadow had rapped against the old wood. He hesitated, every instinct in his body screaming at him to remain silent, to hide from whatever waited beyond the threshold. Yet, the knock came again, this time more urgent, as though the unseen visitor could not, or would not, be ignored. Who's they?" Jonathan croaked, his voice trembling and foreign to his own ears. The chamber seemed to close in around him, the walls pressing tighter, suffocating him with the weight of knowledge he was never meant to possess. A pause. The silence was so complete that Jonathan could hear his own heartbeat, thudding in his chest like the drums of an ancient rite. Then, the voice came, soft and slithering, like a serpent whispering secrets from the depths. "Jonathan Wilkes," it purred, the voice familiar yet alien, twisted with the dark resonance of otherworldly power. "You cannot escape what has been seen. You have been chosen." He staggered back, the edges of his vision blurring as he tried to focus. The room seemed to warp, the familiar contours of bookshelves and the old fireplace dissolving into shadow. And then he saw it, a figure standing in the doorway, draped in robes as dark as the abyss itself, its face obscured by a cowl that seemed to twist and shift, revealing glimpses of other, monstrous visages beneath. The air grew colder, and Jonathan's breath came out in panicked clouds. His limbs felt leaden, shackled by an unseen weight. The figure took a step forward, and with each move, the shadows it cast seemed to darken the room even more. "No one who gazes into the true darkness emerges unscarred," it intoned, its voice a chorus of suffering souls. "You have seen what lurks beyond the veil. Now, you must serve or be consumed." Jonathan's mind splintered, fragments of reason scattered like glass underfoot. He wanted to scream, to flee, but his voice failed him, his body paralyzed. Memories of the altar, the rituals, the eye that had burned his mind, everything came crashing back, each vision a shard of ice piercing his sanity. He reached out, fingers clawing at the air as if trying to grasp some semblance of normalcy, but the figure was already upon him, its presence an avalanche of darkness that blotted out the light. The last thing he saw before the abyss claimed him was the figure's eye, an eye like the one he had glimpsed in the otherworldly void, wide and unblinking, with a depth that seemed to pull him in, pulling him toward a fate far worse than death. The darkness erupted around him, swallowing him whole. And then, there was only silence.
As the echoes of the last tale fade into oblivion, a fresh and foreboding shadow looms, summoning us into a story yet untold. Listen closely, for every whisper may unravel the depths of another unspeakable horror. The autumn of 1883 found me in a state of professional decline and personal disrepair. My name is Corwin Amsel, a name that carried little weight outside the crumbling halls of an obscure academy where I once lectured on natural philosophy. Dismissed for my unconventional theories, namely, that the boundaries of life and death might one day be traversed, I became an itinerant scholar, scraping together a living by cataloguing private collections of dubious antiquity. It was in this destitution that I received a letter from one Bartholomew Grisk, a recluse whose name was whispered in academic circles for his unparalleled library of esoteric knowledge. He invited me to his manor on the Isle of Coldharrow, a barren outcropping battered by relentless waves. The letter was uncharacteristically cordial but bore an unsettling postscript. I require your expertise on matters that may redefine our understanding of existence itself. Come at once. The journey to Coldharrow was as foreboding as the letter that summoned me. The sea, turbulent and grey, seemed to conspire with the oppressive clouds overhead. I arrived at dusk, ferried by a sullen, taciturn sailor who muttered prayers under his breath as the manor loomed into view, a grotesque edifice of jagged stone, its spires clawing at the heavens. Bartholomew Grisk greeted me at the door, his appearance a disconcerting blend of frailty and vigor. His thin frame seemed barely able to contain the frenetic energy in his pale, darting eyes. His handshake lingered, his fingers like cold, articulated bone. "You came," he said, his voice quivering with what I dared not interpret as relief. Few would brave the sea to Coldharrow. Fewer still would accept the implications of my work. But you, Amsel, I knew you would understand. I followed him into the manor, its corridors an oppressive labyrinth of archaic tapestries, glinting relics, and bookshelves that groaned under the weight of knowledge unfit for human minds. The air carried a peculiar chill, laced with an acrid tang I could not place. "You are familiar with the concept of liminal spaces?" Grisk asked abruptly as we descended into his basement laboratory. "Of course," I replied. "The boundaries where one state transitions into another. Twilight is the liminal space between day and night. A doorway the boundary between rooms." Grisk gave a humorless smile. "And what of the ultimate boundary, Amsel? The precipice between life and death?" The laboratory was a ghastly amalgamation of alchemy and modern science. Arrays of glass tubes snaked into vats of viscous, glowing liquid. Strange symbols were etched into the walls, and the centerpiece, a black monolithic structure, defied description. Its surface shimmered as though it were both solid and fluid, its edges shifting in and out of visibility. "This," Grisk said, gesturing to the monolith, "is the result of decades of study and ruinous expense. I call it the Veil Engine. It is not merely a machine, but a conduit, a gateway to the space that lies between." "The space that lies between?" I echoed, feeling a chill creep into my spine. "Between life and death," Grisk hissed, his eyes alight with fervor. "I have glimpsed it, Amsel. A void teeming with entities beyond comprehension. They do not die, not as we understand it. They persist, tethered to a reality just beyond our reach." Grisk's experiments began that very night, and I, despite my growing unease, assisted him. The Veil Engine hummed with an unnatural resonance as Grisk activated it. The air grew dense, vibrating with an unseen force that threatened to crush us. Then, the room grew impossibly still. Shapes began to materialize in the monolith's surface, shifting forms that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions at once. They writhed, stretching toward us, their movements like whispers made visible. "They see us," Grisk muttered, his voice trembling with awe. "Do you feel it, Amsel? The gaze of the undying?" I felt it, though I wished I hadn't. An oppressive weight pressed against my mind, as though my very thoughts were being unraveled. And then, one of the shapes spoke, not in words, but in a resonance that bypassed my ears and echoed directly within my skull. "You are but fleeting shadows. Why do you seek permanence in the eternal void?" Days turned into a haze of experiments and nightmares. Grisk grew increasingly erratic, his body wasting away even as his mind burned with feverish intensity. The Veil Engine began to affect the manor itself. Shadows moved independently of their sources. Doors led to rooms that did not exist. At night, I heard whispers in a language that no tongue should ever speak. I have seen it, Grisk confessed one evening, his face gaunt and sunken. The threshold. It is not a place but a presence, a will that hungers. It does not grant knowledge, it consumes it. You must stop, I implored him. This is not enlightenment, but madness. Madness is merely a term for truths that cannot be borne, he retorted. One night, the Vale engine's hum escalated into a deafening roar. I rushed to the laboratory to find Grisk standing before the monolith, his arms outstretched. Tendrils of shadow coiled around him, lifting him off the ground. They have promised me eternity, he screamed as the tendrils tightened. His body convulsed, his features distorting into something grotesque before the shadows swallowed him whole. The monolith erupted in a blinding light, and I was thrown backward. When I regained consciousness, the laboratory was in ruins, and Grisk was gone. But the monolith remained, its surface dark and still, waiting. As the morning light trickled through the cracked panes of the manor's window, I felt a bone-deep dread settle into my bones. The echoes of Grisk's screams still reverberated in the hollows of my mind, a relentless reminder that the boundary had been crossed, and I had seen the monstrosity that lurked just beyond the veil. I dared not approach the monolith, its surface slick and dark as tar, yet it drew my gaze with an almost sentient pull. It whispered in a language older than the earth, a song without melody and a promise without end. As I stood in the silence, the realization washed over me. The manor itself had become an extension of that abominable space, shifting and alive. Cold Harrow was no longer merely a place, it was now a fissure, a wound in reality. With trembling hands, I searched the scattered remnants of Grisk's notes. They spoke of an entity known only as the Insatiable, a being that thrived on the ignorance of mankind, feeding on the curiosity of those who dared to reach beyond the bounds of mortal comprehension. It was said to be a devourer of consciousness, a presence that left only emptiness in its wake. And now, its presence had claimed Cold Harrow. I turned to the monolith, the room tilting as though in response to my decision. I reached out, the air thickening, swirling with a soundless hum. My fingers brushed against the surface, and in that moment, my mind shattered into 1,000 shards. The monolith was not just a conduit, it was a mirror, reflecting a reality twisted and malleable, where sanity clashed against the unfeeling abyss. What I saw within that mirror was not just vision, it was a revelation that seared itself into the fabric of my being. I found myself standing in a realm of endless shadows, where grotesque shapes loomed just out of sight, their forms shifting with the fluidity of nightmares. Above, an undulating sky churned with a color unseen by human eyes, and from beneath my feet rose a cold, throbbing pulse, an entity breathing in sync with my own heart. Then, I heard it, the voice of the Insatiable, an ancient, inhuman lament that crawled through my skull and coiled around my thoughts. You, the Seeker. You, the Witness. What can you offer to the eternal hunger? I tried to scream, but my voice was drowned by the cacophony of whispers, each one more desperate, more terrified than the last. Faces of those who had come before me twisted in the thrall of the monolith's allure flashed before me, scholars who had lost their minds, explorers who had never returned, and, most hauntingly, Grisk, his expression forever frozen in a silent plea. This is your end, Amsel. The voice coalesced into something more tangible, a figure, gaunt and writhing, with eyes like bottomless pits that mirrored the darkest recesses of my soul. My limbs, once full of defiance, betrayed me, crumbling to the cold, stone floor. I was no longer a man. I was a vessel, a conduit, and in that moment, I understood what Grisk had glimpsed, a truth so vile, so all-consuming that it could not be shared without tearing the fabric of reality apart. And then I felt the pull. The void surged into my being, a relentless flood of alien consciousness that burned away the last remnants of who I was. I became part of it, part of the hunger that never ceased, and I, too, reached for the broken boundary between life and death, between knowing and forgetting. The world outside the monolith shifted, as though the earth itself were recoiling from the invasion that had taken root within my consciousness. I became aware of the silence, a suffocating stillness that seemed to stretch into infinity. The manor was no longer just an abandoned structure, it was the threshold, the liminal space where reality frayed and unraveled, stitched together by threads of something grotesque and unknowable. Time, that once tamed beast, now ran in unpredictable currents, twisting and gnarling like the roots of an ancient tree. The sun, its wan light seeping through the cracked window panes, cast a pale, sickly glow across the room. It struggled to pierce the gloom, as if fearing the dark force that now held dominion over the walls. I could feel its weight, an oppressive presence that pressed down on me, writhing beneath my skin like 1,000 unseen serpents. And then I heard it again, Grisk's voice, fragile and broken, slithering through the dim silence. It was a warning, a plea from the beyond. They come. They always come. The hunger will not be denied. I staggered to my feet, my body moving like a marionette controlled by unseen strings. My eyes searched the room, but the shadows seemed to grow deeper, pressing closer. The whispering grew louder, voices overlapping, each one reaching for my sanity, clawing at the edges of my mind. What lies beyond? The question echoed within my skull, and as I dared to look at the monolith once more, I felt a pulse emanate from it, an unnatural thrum that reverberated through my very bones. The surface rippled, distorting and stretching as though it were made of liquid, and I knew with an unfathomable certainty that something else was coming through. The air became charged, crackling with a sinister energy, and I clutched my head as it threatened to burst from the pressure. Shapes formed within the liquid mirror, grotesque and impossibly ancient, their features an abomination of jagged angles and asymmetrical forms. I could not tell whether they were creatures or mere echoes of thought, but their presence was suffocating, their intentions written in the darkness between them. It was then that I realized what had drawn the others, what had lured them to Cold Harrow and sealed their fate. They were seeking knowledge, craving a glimpse into the forbidden, an attempt to pierce the veil of mortality and touch the eternal. And now I understood the truth. The insatiable fed on more than just fear. It fed on the very essence of curiosity, consuming those who dared to ask, what lies beyond the unknown? I staggered backward, my eyes locked on the writhing figures that emerged from the monolith's surface. Their eyes, black as the void and filled with a hollow, relentless hunger, fixed upon me. Their limbs reached out, impossibly long and sinewy, unfurling like dark vines. The room seemed to narrow, the walls closing in as though the house itself were alive, drawn to the dark ceremony unfolding within it. A tremor, deep and resonant, rolled through the floor, and the manor groaned in response, the creaking timbers joining the chorus of whispers that rose and fell like the tides. I clamped my hands over my ears, trying to drown out the cacophony, but it was no use. The sound had taken on a physical form, a crushing pressure that threatened to splinter my mind. Then, through the suffocating noise, I heard it, a voice, pure and serene, cutting through the chaos like a blade. You must not listen. The voice, unfamiliar yet comforting, seemed to resonate from within me, as though it had always been a part of my soul. It was Grisk's voice, but not as it had been before, distorted and broken. This time, it was clear and resolute, a final echo of his will. I forced my eyes to close, my head spinning as my body strained against the pull of the entity's will. I will not succumb, I whispered, though even to my own ears it sounded feeble. The shadows that coiled around me tightened their grip, their claws biting into the sinews of my flesh, drawing forth blood that glistened like black ink. I summoned every ounce of strength I had left and cast my mind back to the notes that Grisk had left behind, the pages now blurred with the ink of my own madness. I remembered one sentence, the last true thought he had managed to record before he was lost. The way to end it lies not in sight, but in the soul. As the voices of the insatiable surged around me, I focused inward, searching for that ember of resistance buried beneath the churning, alien thoughts that now claimed me. I found it, a fragment of who I had once been, a tether to the world I was now losing. It pulsed, faint and fragile, but it was enough. The monolith shuddered, a deep, reverberating tremor that split the silence, and a rift of blinding, searing light split the room. Shapes howled, their forms unraveling as they were pulled back into the darkness from whence they came. The room erupted into a cacophony of shrieks and the smell of burning stone, as if the very walls were tearing themselves apart. The blinding light ebbed and flowed like the tide, a surge that threatened to drown the remnants of my consciousness. I fell to my knees, the room spinning and shuddering beneath me. The walls were cracked, fissures spreading like veins of black, and the air smelled of scorched earth and the stench of forgotten things. The shadowy figures that had emerged from the monolith now writhed and dissipated, their screeches dissolving into thin, unnatural silence. But the voice, that voice, still whispered in the edges of my mind, relentless as ever. "It is not over." The words dripped with an inhuman calm, and as they echoed, the light dimmed to a mere glow, revealing the room in a ghastly, otherworldly illumination. I dared to raise my head, my vision blurred by exhaustion and terror. Before me, where the monolith had once stood, there was now only an empty space, marked by a scorched, irregular outline of stone. The silence was more profound now, a vacuum that seemed to suck the very life from the air. And in that silence, I could hear the pulse of something ancient, a heartbeat that was not mine but something far greater and far more terrible. "What have you done?" The voice returned, this time in a guttural snarl that rumbled from deep within the manor's foundations. My eyes darted around the room, seeking the source, but I could see nothing except shadows shifting as if alive. The terror that had clawed at me before now coalesced into a singular realization: I had not banished the thing. I had only wounded it, exposed it to the light in a moment of weakness. A low growl, as though the earth itself were in pain, rumbled beneath me. The floor cracked, splintered, and began to splinter further, as if some unseen force were tearing it apart from below. I tried to scramble away, but my limbs felt like lead. They betrayed me, buckling and pulling me into the abyss that yawned open beneath me. The manor was coming apart, its bones breaking under the strain of the forces I had unleashed. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, the voice of the insatiable now a roaring tempest in my ears. "You are the vessel," it said, each word a promise of torment. "And this is only the beginning." My fingers clawed at the floor, desperate to hold on to something, anything, but I was pulled forward, drawn into the chasm of black that seemed to pulse with the living, undying hunger of a thing that knew no end. The walls cracked open, revealing glimpses of a void beyond, where something moved and watched, always waiting. I could feel the cold now, an unnatural chill that cut through me like a blade. My breath came in ragged, uneven gasps as the room tilted, shifting like a grotesque carousel, and I fell. The darkness rose to meet me, filled with the scent of decay and the screech of ancient, forgotten things. It surrounded me, enveloped me, and I knew that I was no longer alone. Whatever had once slumbered beneath the manor was awakening, and I was to be its witness, bound by the soul's dark covenant that had been forged long before I had set foot in Cold Harrow. I knew then that I was to become part of that endless, creeping hunger. My mind broke apart, splintered like the timbers around me, and for a fleeting moment, I felt a strange calm. The battle was over, but the war had only just begun. The endless void seemed to echo with the whispers of the damned, as if the very walls of reality were crumbling away to reveal the primordial chaos beneath. The sensation was as though I had fallen through time itself, through layers of forgotten ages, into a place where even light dared not tread. Every muscle in my body ached as I struggled to comprehend the impossible, my heartbeat thundering in my ears, drowning out the cacophony of shrieks that seemed to radiate from the void itself. There was no sense of up or down, no ground to stand on. I was adrift, surrounded by a darkness that undulated like an immense, sentient sea. The air was thick with a stench of mildew and the copper tang of blood, and it felt as though I was suffocating, inhaling the essence of the abyss. My hands, trembling and slick with sweat, reached out instinctively, seeking something, anything, to anchor me to reality. A sound broke through the darkness, a deep, sonorous thrum that resonated not just in my ears but deep within my very bones. It was the sound of an ancient heartbeat, the rhythm of something vast and unknowable that pulsed with a hunger that defied description. I flinched at its resonance, but it was more than that. It called to me, resonated with a part of me that I did not know existed. The voice of the insatiable, now a chorus of hundreds, filled my mind with a singular promise. The feast begins anew. The darkness stirred, moving as though alive, and I realized with a jolt that I was not alone. There were shapes, shifting, sliding between the edges of my perception, long, sinuous forms that twisted and unfurled in the dark. They were glimpses of something both magnificent and terrifying, entities composed of shifting shadows, glimpses of tentacles, glistening with an unearthly oil that shimmered like liquid midnight. My instinct screamed for me to move, to flee, but there was no direction, no solid ground to push against. My breath caught as I caught sight of a form, a figure that stood separate from the writhing chaos. It was taller than any man, with a body that seemed composed of dark, churning mist, eyes like burning coals that bored into me with a gaze that threatened to unravel my sanity. Its presence seemed to feed on my fear, growing more solid as my dread deepened. "You have awakened the devourer," it spoke in a voice that was both many and one, a chorus of agony that crawled into my ears and writhed in my brain. It was no longer a whisper, it was an accusation. I tried to scream, but my voice cracked, the sound strangled and unrecognizable. The shadows began to converge, and the figure stepped forward, the darkness warping around its limbs like a living shroud. My mind scrambled for logic, for anything to understand what I was seeing. The memory of Cold Harrow clawed at me, the sight of the ruinous monolith, the betrayal of the townsfolk who had long whispered of dark things hidden beneath the manor. And then I realized, with a tremor that made my body shudder, that the darkness was not just around me, it was inside me. The taste of decay filled my mouth, sour and metallic, as if my very being were becoming a vessel for the shadow that lurked behind the veil. I reached out, fingers clawing at the empty space, but the figure was already upon me, its eyes a furnace of unspeakable terror, and its voice the final, echoing note of despair. "The hunger does not end, for it feeds on your soul." The air grew colder, heavy with the weight of 1,000 unspoken secrets. My body convulsed as the presence before me shifted, its form both beautiful and grotesque, a paradox of divinity and destruction. It stepped closer, and the sound of its movement was like the crackling of dry leaves, as if the very fabric of existence were being torn apart. My thoughts splintered, each one more fractured and chaotic than the last. I reached for a memory, any memory, something to anchor me to the reality I knew, a reality that seemed so distant now. Cold Harrow, the manor with its cracked walls, the flicker of candlelight casting long shadows. The voices that whispered secrets in the dark, the dreadful things that had been spoken in hushed tones. Those were not just warnings, they were the chants of those who had once worshipped the unspeakable, who had hoped to harness the hunger that now coiled around my soul. The figure's eyes, molten and impossibly deep, seemed to pierce through my sanity, each glance an invisible claw rending through the shreds of my consciousness. I tried to turn away, to flee, but my legs felt like lead, bound by the tendrils of some malevolent force that writhed in the corners of my mind. A deep, throaty laugh resonated, echoing from the being and mingling with the whispers that surrounded me, voices so familiar yet utterly alien, voices that sounded like my own. The air seemed to grow thick with the cries of the lost, those who had come before me, their fates sealed by the same dark hunger. Their screams were an anthem of torment, a song that had transcended time and space to bind me to my destiny. "You have come to the end of your journey," the creature intoned, its voice now a soft murmur that resonated within me, shaking the last semblances of my will. The shadows erupted, moving with a sudden, violent fervor. They twisted and coalesced into forms that I dared not name, grotesque parodies of once human shapes, their eyes filled with an unending, ravenous thirst. They surged forward, whispering my name in a cacophony that made my vision blur, the syllables clawing at me like the talons of 100 birds. Desperation took hold of me, and I fought against the invisible chains, clawing at the inky void that seemed to hold me in place. The weight of the darkness crushed my chest, every breath a battle for survival. The figure's eyes, now so close that I could see the glistening, oily pupils, widened with a wicked, otherworldly delight. "You cannot escape what has always been," it said, its voice morphing into a chorus of wails. "For within you, the hunger dwells." A sudden realization struck me, sharp as a dagger through my mind. It was not just a creature or an entity, but the embodiment of my own darkest desires, my own latent malice that I had so long denied. It was me, and I was it. And then, as the abyss threatened to consume me whole, the ground beneath my feet cracked, a thin, jagged fissure splitting open with a deafening roar. From its depths, a beam of sickly, greenish light shot up, illuminating the shadows that recoiled in horror, their forms melting and shrieking in a chorus of agony. I reached out to it, the light calling to me as if it were salvation. The being before me let out a roar that shook the very air, its form twisting in anguish as the light grew, searing it with a power so blinding that my eyes burned, my soul screamed for respite. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the silence returned. The light faded, leaving only the stillness of an emptiness that felt almost tangible, an absence so profound that I could hear the beating of my own heart echoing within the void. As the silence stretched into an unbearable eternity, I felt the pulse of the unseen world, a reverberation that hummed through my very bones. The air was electric, charged with an unspeakable tension. I reached out, my hand trembling, and the cold, glassy floor beneath my feet fractured, sending a ripple of jagged lines toward the walls. It was as if the manor itself were tearing apart at the seams, a testament to the power I had unleashed. Suddenly, the voice returned, low and guttural, seeping into my ears like a toxic fog. "You have touched the essence," it whispered, and though the creature was nowhere to be seen, I could feel it clawing at my mind, tendrils of its being burrowing deep into the hollow of my thoughts. But now, the true hunger awakens. A rumbling shudder passed through the earth, and from the fractured walls emerged shapes not of flesh, but of something older, something woven from the very fabric of chaos. They slithered and coiled, their forms a grotesque dance of limbs and mouths, eyes that gleamed like polished obsidian. They were the culmination of every shadow, every whispered sin that had ever passed through Cold Harrow's halls. The hunger had taken shape, and it was looking at me. I stumbled back, my body shivering as I fought to understand what I was seeing. The creature's eyes reflected a hunger so deep it defied reason. It was not the hunger for sustenance or power, it was a hunger for existence itself, a consuming desire to tear the veil between the realms and collapse the world into itself. And then, I heard it, a voice, soft and familiar, calling to me from the darkness. "Remember." Desperation flared in my chest as I sought the source of the voice. There, standing at the edge of the light, was a figure draped in shadow, eyes wide with both terror and sorrow. The memory of the voice, a fragment of hope in a storm of despair, pushed me toward the edge of my sanity. "No," I whispered, the syllable trembling on my lips. "It cannot be. It must be," the figure said, stepping forward, the air shifting as it moved. The shadows around it writhed, recoiling from the purity of its presence. "The hunger feeds on the soul. And the soul is the only thing that can banish it." I reached for the figure, my hand trembling with a mix of fear and hope, but the moment our fingers brushed, the room erupted in a cataclysm of sound and light. The manor splintered apart, and the air grew dense, filled with the stench of decay and the electric bite of raw power. "Remember who you are," the figure cried, its voice barely audible above the roar. With a deafening crack, the shadows coalesced around me, and the power surged within, something cold and ancient awakening in the depths of my being. The creature that had taken root in my mind was no longer separate from me, it was a part of me, as inseparable as breath. I closed my eyes and whispered the name of the one thing I knew would save me, the one thing that had always been my anchor. "Remember." The world shattered, falling into a maelstrom of noise, light, and the cacophony of dying whispers. The hunger screamed, its voice a sound so pure in its malevolence that the world seemed to spin out of control. Then, silence. When I opened my eyes, Cold Harrow was gone, consumed by the chasm that had swallowed it whole. The air was calm, eerily so, and the moon overhead shone brighter than ever before, casting its pale light across the blackened landscape. The remnants of the shadows had vanished, leaving behind only the lingering echo of a whisper that spoke with a final, mournful sigh. I felt the coldness recede, the sensation of something ancient and hungry finally leaving me. The hunger was gone, and so was the figure that had stood against it. Its voice had returned to the silence, no longer bound to the echoes of the dark. But as I stood in the quiet of the night, I knew one thing: some hunger never truly dies. It only waits, patient and still, hidden within the recesses of the mind, waiting for the moment when it might awaken again. And so, I walked away, my soul scarred but unbroken, knowing that I was no longer the same as before, something that had seen the depths of madness and emerged to tell the tale. Yet in the stillness, I could feel it, a thrum, a whisper, a promise that the hunger would return, hungry and patient, as it always had.